This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney.
The real outperformance has been the U.S. corporate high yield.
Are the companies lean enough? Have they trimmed all the fat?
The semiconductor business is a really cyclical business.
Breaking market headlines and corporate news from across the globe.
Do investors like the M&A that we've seen?
These are two big-time blue-chip companies.
The window between the peak and cut changing super fast.
Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, coming up in this hour, we're going to have some smart conversation. We're going to kick off with Bobby Go. She's Bloomberg News senior editor on the latest news out of Iran. He can also talk about last week's Qatar Economic Forum. He was there and give us the latest there. Mike McGlone, Bloomberg Intelligence senior commodity strategist. He's in-house. We saw him walk in the hallways earlier. He's usually ensconced down in Miami Beach, so we're going to bring him in studio and talk about copper. $11,000. It's crazy what's going on in the copper market. Gold following as well. So we'll talk about all things commodities. So that's just coming up in this next half hour. So lots of good stuff there. All right, right now, let's kick off this hour with the Bloomberg Business Flash and John Tucker.
And this Bloomberg Business Flash being brought to you by BNY Mellon Insight, June 4th to the 6th in Nashville, Tennessee. Don't miss the essential event for the financial advice community. Visit insight.bnymellon.com. Major stock averages adding to their records. Investors expressing their confidence ahead of the earnings from the poster child for artificial intelligence, NVIDIA. They're going to report on Wednesday. And ahead of that, those shares up 2.3%. And then you have the cruise lines. They're powering ahead, helping lift the S&P 500. Norwegian cruise lines helping lead the market there, cruising ahead 7% higher after delivering some financial forecasts for the year, topping analyst expectations. Well, after the records last week, Cameron Dawson at New Edge Wealth sees stocks pushing ever higher.
This market could still have room to run. It doesn't mean that we can grow complacent on things like EPS growth and GDP growth, which we think are really important to watch. But the technical backdrop is supportive. We're not quite overbought yet, which just means that we've hit all-time highs and there likely is some still gas in the tank.
S&P 500, 19 points higher, on 0.4%, 53.22 record. Dow Jones Industrial Average of 48 points, up 0.1%. 40,051 record. NASDAQ 100, 111 points higher, up 0.6%. 18,657 record there. CalPERS, largest state public pension fund in the U.S., says it'll vote against all ExxonMobil directors. They're saying the oil giant undermining shareholder rights. And we check the markets for you all day long, right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Alex.
Thank you so much, John Tucker. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. I completely forgot what we needed to talk about at the top of the last hour. Paul went to Walmart for the first time in how long?
Actually, you know what? I think it's the first time ever. I was just thinking back because I thought we had gone before, but I checked and it was at Target.
So, and what did you do? How did you walk through it?
It did not disappoint. It lived up to all expectations. I mean, it's just the first thing that knocked me over is just they have one of everything. Mm-hmm. Everything. I mean, who manages the inventory there? It's got to have a PhD from somewhere. Just at that store in Brick, New Jersey. I don't know how they do it. And then the other thing is you turn the corner after being down the widget aisle, and there's like this monster supermarket right there.
Yep.
With like bananas and stuff like that. So they have it all. It's unbelievable. That's number one. Number two. Man, they have a lot of employees there. Mm-hmm. There are people all over the place stocking and restocking.
Did you see the door greeter?
I saw the door greeter, and they now have a dude who sits you when you leave because everybody self-checkouts and they take the receipts and so we had our receipt. So that's a new position. I didn't know about that.
Yeah. Wow.
Okay.
This feels monumental.
Yeah.
I feel like we're going to watch those sales in New Jersey, same-store sales for Walmart in May. All right. Let's get some other update here on what's going on with the markets. There's lots of fun stories happening, even though the overall headline level is just, hey, go buy stocks. Let's get to it. Alexander Semenova joins us from Bloomberg. You are obviously looking at NVIDIA.
The one and only NVIDIA. Obviously, the company reports results this week, and it's going to be a make or break event both for the stock and for the broader market. But shares are actually on the move today as well. It's up more than 2% today after Barclays increased its price target to $1,100 from $850. They see more upside for data center revenue compared to current estimates. And there have been concerns throughout the quarter of a possible air pocket in the middle of the year for NVIDIA, but analyst Tom Tom O'Malley says that these calls are seemingly overblown. Bank of America had a really interesting note this morning. They had some great stats on NVIDIA. It's about to be a year since, a one-year anniversary since their blowout results last May. And since then, NVIDIA has added $1.5 trillion to its market cap. Earnings over the last 12 months grew 617% year over year, and mentions of AI spiked 186% during earnings calls.
That is great.
Incredible.
Great reporting there. I didn't know a lot of that stuff. Today, a market cap of $2.32 trillion. The stock's up 90% year to date, 200% over the past 12 months. So
amazing.
I'm not sure, because that's real. That's not hype.
No.
That's real. As Alex, you were reporting, the earnings are there to support it. I've never seen anything like that.
Well, also, I mean, the issue is going to be about the supply, not the demand, right? So
Exactly.
even if they quote unquote disappoint, it's because of a supply backlog issues.
A portfolio manager I spoke to pointed to AMD, what we saw with super microcomputers, where they did have the demand, but the supply was a concern in their guidance. And obviously the next day the stock slumped for each of those companies. He said, I don't see why it would be different for NVIDIA, but I guess we will wait and see when they report.
That's a different story than the demand. Really cool. All right, you're also looking at Hims and Hers Health, but they're really just Hims, right? I mean,
Yes. So that stock is up about 30% right now. This is after they said that they're getting into GLP-1 drugs. The company debuted a $199 weight loss shot at an 85% discount to Wegovy. So this company is known for making cheaper versions of, popular
But is this
medications.
the same? Is it the same thing as like Wegovy? It's not a knockoff.
Is.
I mean, it's not like a. It's kind of like it, or
It is. It's a weight loss shot.
Okay.
That's the market
All
they're
right.
referring to.
But it's one of those what's it called again? It's like it's not the exact same thing, but they're able to do it through a compounding pharmacy. So it's basically they can do things a little bit differently and not have necessarily the same ingredients, but have the same effect. And typically you would do this if, say, you have an allergy and you go to a compound pharmacy and you can't have one ingredient in a drug, and then they change it for you. And because the drugs are in such short supply, Hims has been able to also do this for the weight loss drug, but it is not followed or registered by the FDA. It's not regulated by the FDA, so therein lies. I got really into this because I was like, what? This is something I feel like my husband would see the commercial and be like, cool, and I'd be like, no, we're not doing that. What else are you looking at?
I'm also looking at Johnson Controls International. Shares are up about 3% right now. This is after Elliott Investment Management had built a large position in the company. This is Bloomberg's reporting, citing sources familiar with the matter. Elliott's position is worth more than $1 billion, which puts it among the top 10 investors in the company. Carmen Reinecke on my team had a really good story on Elliott's stakes not too long ago, and apparently companies that it has taken stakes in have done very well. So you can see that stock moving higher today on the news.
All right, looking at that, Johnson Controls, JCI, didn't even know about it, $47 billion market
JCI.
company, up 23% year to date, 52-week high. So, I mean, they're doing something right.
Yeah.
This is one of the first companies that I was introduced to like 17 years ago. A portfolio manager was saying like,
Really?
yeah, JCI. And I'm like, that
It's
sounds
an Irish
cool.
company,
Tell me
too.
about it.
I do not know about these guys. So they provide building products and technology solutions. The company offers air systems, building management, HVAC control, security, and fire safety solutions. Not bad, based in Cork County, Ireland.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll visit on my September trip over over there.
That's cool. Yeah, definitely go to an industrial company
Yep.
when you're in Ireland. That sounds like a Charlie Pellet.
Hey, honey,
For
we're not
sure.
going to this castle. We're going to see this place.
Score. All right, Alexander. Thanks a lot. Alexander Simonova joining us from Bloomberg News. All right, let's get to the news item over the weekend and also take a look back at Qatar's economic forum, because a lot of interesting things came out of that last week. Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi died yesterday in a helicopter crash with his foreign minister. That was the news. We want to go to Bobby Ghosh. He's senior editor at Bloomberg News, and he joins us through Zoom. He follows a lot of geopolitical issues along these lines with us. Bobby, where does this leave Iran? What is the instability risk here?
Well, this has never happened in Iran's recent history. No sitting president has ever died. So this is a fork in the road that Iran has never come to before. This regime likes to convey a sense of stability and continuity, but it has not been tested in this manner before. I, for one, don't expect a great deal of instability. Because let's remind ourselves, the person who really pulls the strings in Iran is not the president. It is the supreme leader who is unelected. Ali Khamenei is his name. He sits above the entire government and, frankly, the entire administration. And he calls all the important shots. His policies are the ones that the president and others implement. He hasn't changed. He's old and ill, and quite ill. He's 85 years old. And so there are some concerns about succession there. And there was some thought that President Raisi would be the logical successor to the supreme leader. Now that's off the charts. But there's going to be an election in 50 days. Anytime there is an election, there is always an opportunity, however slim it might be, for other voices to be heard. The regime will try to maintain that continuity by making sure that the new president, whoever he is also a hardliner, just like Raisi. But, you know, this is a black swan event. And the things about black swan events are that you really can't be absolutely certain about what's going to happen next, precisely because it's never happened before.
Bobby, is there any reason to believe the death of the Iranian president will alter in any way Iran's views or actions or policies as it relates to the broader Middle East here? I'm thinking Gaza, Israel, what's happening today.
I wouldn't be optimistic about that. Again, Khamenei is the one whose policies are being implemented. Yep. He's not going to change his mind. He's an old school, dyed-in-the-wool hardliner. He hates Israel. He hates America. And no matter who becomes president, they will basically have to do what Khamenei says. The other joker in the pack is the IRGC, which is the military arm of the Iranian state. They're also very hardline, and they will basically not tolerate a government that is softer towards the West. Mm-hmm. So I don't expect any significant change in foreign policy from the Iranians, no matter who becomes president.
You were also last week at Qatar's Economic Forum. I mean, huge lineup of guests. What were some of the takeaways that you had from that? Like, what should we be keying in on?
Well, interestingly and coincidentally, the number one theme, and this took me by surprise, was geopolitics and instability. I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised because of what's going on in the region, the war in Gaza. Now, look at it from this distance, you might think, well, that's a very localized conflict that's just taking place in Gaza that does not involve the rest of the Middle East. And the price of oil is stable. The governments in the Middle East are all more or less stable. And so they wouldn't be concerned, but actually there was a lot of concern. We heard from the Prime Minister of Qatar about his concerns about the fact that the ceasefire talks between Hamas and Israel are not going anywhere. We heard from the Prime Minister of Malaysia. We heard from the President of Indonesia. We also heard about the geopolitical uncertainties that are sort of continuing from the conflict in Ukraine with Russia invading Ukraine. We heard from the president of Poland who talked about that. So it was really quite, my perception was that the sessions, look, it was a very well-attended event and all the sessions were very well-attended, but the ones that seemed to capture people's imaginations were around the idea that we are now going through a period of instability because of wars, hot wars between countries, and the Cold War between the United States and China, and everything else. Everybody's strategy, every company's way of thinking of the world, every government's way of thinking of the world has to be refracted through these lenses of conflict. That was quite striking to me.
Bobby, here's my ignorant question of the day, just from a geography perspective. The Persian Gulf nations are attracting so much capital, and there's so much optimism about many of those, that part of the world there, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, for example. I guess how closely are they kind of thought of from investors' perspective with the Middle East, with what's going on in Israel, Egypt, and Gaza? I mean, are they considered two separate regions? So if I'm thinking about investing in, Qatar, for example, I'm not too concerned about the regional conflicts, or am I?
Well, you would think that, but a lot of international investors outside of the Middle East are not making that distinction. And they are, that we've heard recently, for instance, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a long way from the war zone. The Saudis have a robust economy, while gas prices are high, a pretty strong economy. They're sitting on a massive, massive war chest. They're building these gigantic projects, a whole new city in the desert, and they're open for business. They want foreign investors to come, and you'd think foreign investors would want to get in on the ground floor in a lot of those projects. Not happening. Not happening. The Saudi, as RBN Bloomberg News colleagues have reported, they're really struggling to get foreign investors. And some of that is to do with the larger geopolitical instability in the region. Some of it is specifically to do with events in Saudi Arabia.
When we take a look at geopolitics, how we're very obviously U.S.-centric because we're in the middle of New York, right? How interested is the rest of the world in the 2024 presidential election? Like, how did the Biden-Trump scenario play out in Qatar?
Oh, yeah. Every conversation I had, bar none, every conversation with every delegate, all wanted to know, oh, you're from New York. What's going on with the election? Is Biden really going to win? Is Trump really going to win? There was some attempt we heard from Ken Griffin, for instance, on the stage, who said that, who gave the impression that it wouldn't really matter. He seems to favor a Trump presidency, a return of Trump. But there were some attempts from stage from various speakers to say, oh, the U.S. economy is robust and it doesn't matter. That is not how it was reflected in my private conversations with people off the stage. A lot of it was really, really deep concern. The things that they are seeing from that distance taking place in America are unprecedented. An American former president in court for every day with the possibility of going to jail. There's a lot of concern about that. Would that lead to instability? Would that lead to something, a repetition of the storming of Congress? There's concern about the age of the candidates, even in a part of the world where leaders tend to be quite old. So that was the backdrop against which all conversations took place.
All right, Bobby, thank you so much for joining us there. Bobby Ghosh, she's a senior editor for Bloomberg News, joining us from New York via Zoom. Busy on the geopolitical front, and we'd like to have access to Bobby and his world view and all of his experience there. Again, the death of the Iranian president over the weekend, and then, of course, the economic forum in Qatar. A lot going on in that part of the world, obviously.
Yeah, and also I'm sure that LNG played prominently also, just in terms of that being a key product that the U.S. has, as well as Japan and Qatar and the UAE, and then also securing that sort of energy security conversation as well. I'm just so interested, if I'm a CEO of a company, how do you possibly make long-term investment decisions in this political environment, U.S. and globally? Like, how do you do that?
I think well, I don't know. I think you have to think that these investments are going to outlive the next 4 years, the next whatever, But when you don't have sanctions and trade restrictions,
and how do you have?
And they're so different, one side versus the other. Before, there were distinctions between Republicans and Democrats, but like everything else in the world today, those distinctions seem to be more stark these days, and that includes regulatory restrictions, tariffs. But now we've got the Biden administration not only maintaining the Trump administration tariffs, but adding new ones, which is something you wouldn't necessarily think
It's like, how do you deglobalize? How do you deglobalize and also decarbonize and also grow? How do you do all of those three things at once? A big part of that conversation, I will talk my book, is copper and metals. So coming up, we're going to talk to Mike McGlone, a Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Commodity Strategist. We have a record high on gold and copper. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. A major stock average is on track to set new records again. Only 4 of the 11 major industry groups in the S&P 500 are higher, though. The best performing group right now that belongs to information technology, and that is home to NVIDIA. Shares of NVIDIA right now up close to 2% ahead of their earnings report. We get that on Wednesday. And in terms of the index points, it's the cruise line stocks that are the leaders there that are raising earnings guidance. Norwegian Cruise Lines, that is up close to 8% right now. Overall, S&P 500, 17 points higher. That's up 0.3%. We're at 5320 on the index. Dow Jones Industrial Average, 41 points higher. That's up 0.1%. That's at 40,045. The NASDAQ 100, 101 points higher. That is up 0.6%. That's at 18,647. Records all around. And we check the markets for you all day long, right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Alex and Paul.
All right, John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Alex Steele, Paul Sweeney. We're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming live on YouTube as well, so head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Podcast. Commodities. Let's talk the hard commodities, the metals. We'll get to the softs another day, another time. It's all about copper and gold and all that kind of stuff. I don't know what's going on there. Mike McGlone does, because he's been doing this his whole life. He's the senior commodity strategist for Bloomberg Intelligence. He's usually down in South Beach, but we got him up here in New York where the real people work. So, Mike, thanks so much for joining us here. First, I haven't heard about copper in a while. Now it's every day we're hitting new highs. What's going on there?
Yeah, it finally has. There's been some nuances there, but it's the key thing you started off with, the hard commodities, and there's everything else. The hardest commodities are the metals. So let's point out the Bloomberg All Metals Total Index, Total Return Index is up 20% this year. That just tracks the hard commodities. So copper's a big part of it, but the way I look at copper, it's kind of just catching up to gold in the stock market. It's made a new high. In the U.S., $5.20 a pound, a new high.
What's the ticker I should be using for copper?
HG1.
Okay. All right, I'm on it.
And
that's for
US.
the COMEX versus the LME.
And I knew Alex would go over it and point out. You got to point out the LME. It's in metric tons. But since we're Yanks, we'll talk about that. I get confuzzled with both of them. So the key thing I like to point out is what I'm concerned about is it's catching up to the S&P 500 because it has a very high correlation. I remember Alex pointed out once that if you look at those two, they're like tick for tick. But managed money net possessions, like hedge funds, futures, stuff I used to trade and used to watch, they're really long. 32% of open interest. That's the highest since 2021. So they're on top of this trade. They're making money, and it's rare that markets can really stay going up when they're that long already. So the key thing I look at is, and then there's the macro. I look at the U.S. stock market. In some ways, it's very stretched, just versus a 100-week moving average is 22%. And then China. Number one thing is China. Just look at bond yields in China. So those two key factors for copper to stay strong in the long term, obviously very bullish copper. But China in decline and the U.S. stock market very expensive means I think these hedge funds are more likely to have to hit their stops on their longs and get stopped out at some point.
So a couple of things that you get all that?
I'm stopping out of my copper.
So there's a couple different exchanges, right, that you look at, and that's London, then it's the U.S., and then that's Shanghai. And you can do a lot of arb trades, right, where you can go long one and short the other based on where you think the demand's going to be. And that's kind of what Mike was talking about in terms of there was a short on the U.S. inventories and a long on the Shanghai copper, and then all of a sudden that you got a short squeeze that reversed, and now there's stories about
Let's break this down to what,
shippers.
so normal people can understand this. Doing the bathroom.
I was trying to help
Doing
you
the
do that.
bathroom.
Okay.
I'm not using a lot of copper. I'm using cross-linked polyethylene tubing.
Well, actually, that's an excellent point.
PEX.
Because if it gets too expensive, then you're going to see substitutions, right? And that's is the bull thesis for copper as bullish as the bulls say, which is basically like you're going to have endless demand in the energy transition forever.
Javier Blas's column this morning, I forget the title of it, was pointed out that is the problem. And copper is very autocorrelated. It's almost like silver. Silver's earned the reputation as the devil's metal because it only goes down after it goes up. I'm worried about that happening in copper. It's like, okay, you had to hear that first. Yeah. But it's the autocorrelation factor. So I think people are buying into the bullish thesis, and it makes sense in the long term. But for a trader standpoint, when you see these type of nuances where the stock market's really expensive, it's catching up, managed money position is really strong. And China having problems, and by the way, China is the biggest buyer on the planet of gold. It kind of makes me very scared about getting longer copper. Now, I'm very enduringly bullish gold. I mean, gold could correct 10%, it still doesn't matter. The fact is central banks are buying gold, they're not buying copper. The key thing is, that's one thing I've heard. There's rumors that maybe China's hoarding some other metals. Have you heard that, Alex?
I have not heard it, but that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
I mean,
it makes sense.
You could make an argument that the U.S. should also be having a strategic reserves of things like nickel and lithium and stuff like that for the energy transition. No, we do not. We have oil.
As far as we know, we don't.
This is true. But so I'm glad you pointed out Javier's column. So Javier Blas, Bloomberg Opinion columnist, I highly recommend you guys read it. And he was saying that the big distinction between, say, oil and copper is that oil, once you use it, you burn it, it's done. Copper, you use it, if you put it in your pipe for your bathroom or whatever, that's going to be there for a very long time. And you can also then reuse copper too. So it doesn't have the same kind of demand pull, endless demand pull in the same way, even if structurally you are looking at stronger demand because of the energy transition. I found that to be very thought-provoking.
The headline of his article was "Copper's boom story has some truth and much hogwash." And that's what I love is the hogwash. Is when you hear everybody say the same thing. I've heard it so many times. Like, remember crude oil 2 years ago? It was going to 115. We're at $80. You hear it in commodities, got to be very careful. The only one that usually really works in the long term is gold.
And that's what you've been telling us since day one. So, all right, so if I'm trying to come up with a trade here. Copper, I feel like it's technically high. Technicals are driving this thing. So it's just a question. When I see this thing roll over, you short it. Because
I look at it as a trader. I'd be willing to, I can't say it anymore, but I would structure like a put strategy. I would be thinking that.
Right.
And so why not? Also, the thing is, it's the trickle down. If copper starts trickling down, it's probably going to be related to this U.S. stock market, related to China. And it's that deflationary trajectory I see. You look at CGBs, Chinese government bond yields at 2.3% versus our 10-year note yield at 4.4%. That's very rare, and that's an indication from a sovereign market of deflationary trends in the world's second largest economy.
Well, also, I mean, talking about the trade, just because it may go down doesn't mean it's going to go to zero. Like, okay, if it's at like say 10,000 on the LME, you take a little bit of heat off. It's not. It's still not. We're still going to be using it, and there is still a bull thesis. You don't have to necessarily be a crazy bull, though.
Yeah, well, commodity people think trading, right, a lot. So I look at copper very simply. If you're looking at, people look at 4 as kind of the key pivot. Once it broke above $4 a pound, which was at the end of March, it shot up. It was a good technical signal. Now it's like, you just got to be careful with that big thesis of everybody's piling on. That's what I point out from a commodity standpoint. Yes, they were very cheap versus the stock market just a few months ago, and they still are. And I'm hearing a significant allocation towards commodities. But I always like to point out, well, stick with the metals. Bloomberg All Metals Index typically is the best performance over time. Start with gold. And if you're really interested in broader commodities, energy equities typically way outperform things like USO.
All right, let's switch gears to gold, another high. So is this, I mean, you've been saying long gold, short everything else for years and years and years. What's the case for gold here other than, I guess, the Chinese are buying it?
It starts, I think, with the macroeconomic situation. You know, unlimited friendship shifted the world order. The world's largest buyer of gold right now is China. Central banks, the World Gold Council pointed out that Q1 was the biggest Q1 ever. And their view is it's going to continue. Okay, so that's what matters. But here's put some numbers on. There's been 30 million outflows from gold ETFs in terms of ounces, and about 100 million purchases of ounces from central banks. So what's been significant is the banks are buying, deepest money in pockets who can print dollars are buying gold, and there's issues with, China, Russia. But investors like to say in this country is, why buy gold if you get a 5% T-bill in the stock market? It's on a tear. That, to me, is going to flip at some point. Because we had so much outflows in ETFs, at some point that's going to turn back up, and that, to me, accelerates the gold rally.
So here's one question with gold, though. Just because China keeps buying it doesn't mean they're going to keep buying it.
Exactly. That's why I had lunch with a World Gold Council member last year, and last week, and I always try to pin them down. What's your expectation? Yes, that's the risk they could stop, but it's not just China. Like in the last data, the number one buyer was Turkey. Singapore Monetary Exchange was a big buyer. They're starting to add up, and I think it's part of that kind of run away from the dollar situation to worry about. Like I say, it started with the unlimited friendship.
WTI, $80 a barrel here. What are we doing with gold?
With
oil. Sorry.
I think it's more likely, and I've been wrong, but early, maybe, more likely to go to 50 than higher. Because look at WTI. The price right now on the screen was first traded in 2007. And what happens when it goes up? It goes down. Why? Because it creates more supply and demand. So the key fact is what's pressured crude oil for the last 15 years is the excess of supply to U.S. and Canada. And now we have that building surplus out of OPEC. So to me, it's just about matter of time it goes lower. So it has also been an example. Natural gas did it. It got too expensive. It got down to low price cure, the lowest price since 1990, and it bounced. I think crude oil's found that trajectory. You have to shut off that excess of supply out of the U.S. And here's key facts. Diesel demand, unleaded gas demand, and containerboard demand in this country are all in recessionary trajectories.
Okay.
We did the container shipping, the container board stuff, box stuff last week.
We did.
Heard
Yeah,
that,
see?
and we heard that. And yes.
We did hear that, but it also, you're having some refiners open up now after maintenance season, and it is summer driving season. So even if the demand isn't great, you may just continue to see a little bit uptick in demand because we're going to drive more. I don't know. We see.
Because he drives like 17 hours a day, and the Michael Barr. You put those two together.
It should be better for them, but they're going to complain anyway. So there is that.
Okay, and then they have the congestion pricing they have to pay.
Well, that's a whole different bag of chips on that. Hey, Mike, good to see you. Good to see you in studio. Mike McGlone, Bloomberg Intelligence, Senior Commodity Strategist. Always fun to talk to. Coming up, we're going to continue sort of the copper clean energy situation here. Paul Lascano is Bloomberg NEF Senior Associate. We're going to talk about clean energy and his outlook and some of the data points there. We're also going to get you updated right now with Michael Barr on world and national news.
Thank you very much, Alex. Paul, John, former President Donald Trump's criminal hush money trial is entering its final stretch in Lower Manhattan. The defense continues to cross-examine Trump's former fixer, Michael Cohen. Judge Juan Marchand now says closing arguments aren't expected until next week due to the long Memorial Day weekend. Trump's attorneys have told the prosecutors there are 3 other potential witnesses, including Trump himself. Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi, the country's foreign minister, and several other officials have been found dead. Their helicopter crashed in a foggy mountainous region in northwest Iran. Bloomberg's Roz Matheson says the government will now have to find a replacement for Raisi.
In the immediate term, his deputy, the first vice president, is stepping in as president in an interim basis. That's till an election can be held, will likely be within 50 days. The question is, who do the senior leadership see as their preferred candidate in that election? Because, of course, they are elections, but they're very, very carefully managed in that process. And so it's really a factor of who do they want as their preferred candidate.
Bloomberg's Roz Matheson. A huge win for Julian Assange in London's High Court. He's been granted the right to appeal his extradition to the U.S. Julian Assange's wife, Stella, says the judges reached the right decision.
We spent a long time hearing the United States putting lipstick on a pig, but the judges did not buy it.
The WikiLeaks founder faces charges in the U.S. over his website's publication of a trove of classified documents almost 15 years ago. The U.S. Supreme Court turned away a challenge to a Maryland law that bans semi-automatic assault-style rifles and large-capacity magazines. The justices, however, took no action on appeals over a similar Illinois law. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. A major stock average is headed for new records. Investors gearing up for earnings from the artificial intelligence leader in chips, that is, NVIDIA, getting a boost after a bullish analyst call there. NVIDIA has the third highest weighting in the S&P 500 behind Microsoft and Apple. So all this matters. S&P 500 heading for its 24th record this year. Meantime, Steve Schiaparoni at Federated Global says the environment for investors at this point, it's just fine.
The bulk of the probability is inflation that is grinding slowly lower and growth that is also softening but not troublesomely. And so it's fine. It's a fine environment for bonds. It's a fine environment for cash. And it's a fine environment for stocks.
Some of the individual standout shares of Hims and Hers Health soaring right now. They're up close to 34%, offering a treatment with the same active ingredient as Wegovy for only $199 a month. And then Norwegian Cruise, after their positive results, they were up 8.3%. The other cruise liners helping power the S&P 500 as well. And the S&P 500 overall 19 points higher. That's up 0.4%, 53.22 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average up 53 points. That's up 0.1%. We're at 40,056, record there. The NASDAQ 100, same story, up 119 points. That's a rise of 0.6%. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Alex.
All right, thanks so much, John Tucker. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We bring you all the top news and from analyst perspective on Bloomberg Intelligence. They cover about 2,000 companies in 130 industries worldwide. And then every Monday at this time, we also bring you the viewpoint of our Bloomberg NEF amazing analysts. So Bloomberg NEF has in-depth research that covers commodity, power, transport, industry, buildings, ag sectors, and cross-cutting technologies that's going to help business and finance and the government try and decarbonize over time. It's a critical part of how we transition. So joining us now is Paul Lascano. He's Bloomberg NEF Senior Associate. And you guys just did your U.S. Clean Energy Outlook, which looks at some trends over the next 10 years, so kind of moving past that 2030 mark. And I should point out that a lot of the research you guys do is quoted by street analysts. Like, this is their first stop in many cases. What was the most fascinating part of this outlook for you?
Well, there's a huge uncertainty with the November elections, obviously. So a lot of the questions a lot of the guidance that our clients are seeking us out for is what's going to happen with all the IRA incentives if the Republicans take over the presidency and the House and the Senate. And our short answer is not much. We don't think that's going to have that Republicans, if they were in power, they would be able to roll back all of the subsidies that essentially are turbocharging the growth of solar and wind in the U.S., mostly because what we show in our outlook is how much Republican states are benefiting from all the solar and wind and the batteries coming online, all the manufacturing. So really, we don't see that political risk as being that high, and clients are really worried about it and really try to look at those numbers very closely to see where that wind and solar is getting built to understand what the real risk there is.
I know John and I can't forecast what we're going to have for lunch, much less at the 2035. But just broadly, for those of us ignorant in this discussion here, what percentage of our energy do we get from new energy,
like wind and solar kind of thing?
Wind and solar kind of thing today versus maybe where you guys think the number might be in 2035?
Yeah, so it's low at this point, and we like to...
Is it like 5%, 10%?
Yeah, like single digits overall U.S.-wide, and if you add nuclear, then it goes a little higher, so it maybe like in total you can maybe reach around 20%, I would have to look, but it's still low and there's still a lot of room to grow.
So based on that then, why are you guys confident that the election won't change anything? So you said that it's important to look where the wind farms and the solar farms are. Am I assuming to imply that means they're in red states?
Yes, correct.
Okay. What about things like hydrogen and some of those tax credits and anything to do with nuclear, things that aren't as obvious when it comes to solar and wind?
Yeah, that's hydrogen and nuclear. Well, nuclear is a very, very difficult sector for many other different reasons other than just incentives, but also the politics and the safety concerns and environmental concerns are a big part of the nuclear discussion. In terms of hydrogen, hydrogen is it's a sector that is going to benefit a lot of red states as well, Texas being the obvious example. And hydrogen is also going to be like a huge beneficiary of cheap wind and solar, because in order to produce green hydrogen, you need very cheap cost of power, which is the input to create that green hydrogen through electrolysis. And the companies really heavily investing in hydrogen and trying to push a lot of the hydrogen demand are oil and gas companies or traditional chemical companies who are that are based in red states as well, and obviously have a more conservative agenda when it comes to the energy transition.
We're definitely not in a red state, are we, Paul, in New Jersey?
Well, you go south. I'm going to go, you go central to South Jersey. We can debate whether that is red, dude.
Well, that's true. The reason I bring it up is because there are wind farms proposed, and I think they're in the final stages being built off the coast. My question to you is, the people behind the wind farms, behind the solar farms, who are they? Are they in business to make money? Are we going to be the beneficiaries in New Jersey from a wind farm off the Jersey shore, or do they wheel it on the grid to the highest bidder?
It's a good question. The companies behind building those wind farms are obviously in the business of making money, and some of them have like quite profitable, build quite profitable projects. The offshore wind is a particular example, and it's just because of the magnitude and the complexity of building an offshore wind farm, which it's quite obvious. You're building something like miles offshore, and from a logistical standpoint and a cost standpoint, it's highly unpredictable and difficult. So what they are asking for is they're asking for guaranteed contracts from whoever buys that power to guarantee them how much they're going to pay, so that they can internalize those numbers and make sure to run the numbers themselves and make sure that they make a good amount of money.
Yeah, there's no world in which we don't pay more for electricity, at least in the short term. I just don't see how that's possible.
And that takes me to another question. I don't know if you can answer this one, but smart metering, I've heard so much about it, and those that have it have seen their electric bills go up and not necessarily have more knowledge or more control over the source of that electricity either. Is that the panacea for electric generators, the smart meters where they can actually turn off your air conditioning during peak load in the summer?
Yeah,
John Tucker's really into this, by the way. Let's just make a moment. Wow. Like he went from like not listening at all to these segments to like being the prime driver. Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, well, no.
I'll go away.
Well, in general, and to your point, Alex, too. We're seeing negative prices across many of the biggest power markets in the U.S. And it's a very complicated supply and demand and intermittency issue. But the bottom line to bring that back to your point on smart meters is that there's a huge potential to make where we consume the power much smarter. Obviously, the meter being the interface is one way to do it. But you can really manage the load, manage how much and when you use the power in order to match the negative prices, in order to match those very low prices. And there's consumers in Texas who are already getting credits and refunds of like hundreds of dollars at a time just because they turned their EV charging off or they chose to charge during hours of negative prices.
So much more to talk about. We're going to get you back. This is great. All of these issues are so important to how we're going to afford to do stuff in the next few decades. So thank you so much, Paul. Really appreciate it. Paul Lascano, he joins us from Bloomberg NEF, a senior associate on their U.S. clean energy outlook for the next 10 years. We will get you back. Paul?
Breaking news coming across the Bloomberg terminal. That is from my time when I first came on Wall Street in the mid-'80s. This was the story. Ivan F. Boesky, rogue trader in 1980s, Wall Street scandal, dies at 87. I mean, this was it, John. I mean, Ivan Boesky, Michael Milken, the traders from Kidder. I mean, the bankers from Kidder. I mean, it was just nonstop.
And just the stories I could tell you, just from Rumson, New Jersey, one of the traders there, Mr. Mulhern, who has since passed away, his relationship and what that led to. Unbelievable stories.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
And I'm John Tucker in the newsroom. Look at some of the company stories we are following for you. Google trying to steal customers from Microsoft. Government agencies that switch 500 more users to Google Workplace Enterprise Plus for 3 years. They're going to get a 1 year free and be eligible for what they call a significant discount for the rest of the contract. Now, all the customers are going to receive free consulting services to help them make the switch. Google is betting Microsoft's very public cybersecurity failures are going to give them the advantage. Last month, the Cyber Safety Review Board from the U.S. issued a scathing report documenting Microsoft's inability to stop China-linked hackers from breaking into the email accounts of U.S. officials last year. This one from the New York Times. A congressional investigation found that BMW, Jaguar, Land Rover, and Volkswagen purchased parts that originated from a Chinese supplier flagged by the U.S. for taking part in forced labor programs in a western region of China where the local population, the Uyghurs, are subject to mass surveillance and detentions. This report said both BMW and Jaguar Land Rover continue to import components made by the Chinese company into the U.S. in violation of American law, even after they were informed in writing about the presence of banned products in their supply chains. And over a month into CEO Elon Musk's plans to slash at least 10% of the company workforce, he's still not done. This means anxious employees are waking up each day to check their messages, wondering if they still have a job. These rolling job cuts likely to extend through at least June. This, according to our sources at the company. Tesla's workforce already has endured a dramatic transformation the last few years. And that's a look at some of the company stories we're following.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
Happy Monday, everybody. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney and John Tucker. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We cover all the top business and economic news for you through our lens of our Bloomberg Intelligence analysts. They cover 2,000 companies in 130 industries worldwide. We also bring you and keep you up to date with world and national news. And for that, here's Michael Barr. Michael?
Thank you very much, Alex. Paul, John. Iran's supreme leader has called for 5 days of mourning after the country's president, Ibrahim Raisi, has died. Raisi, a hardline protege of the country's supreme leader, died Sunday along with the foreign minister and other officials in a helicopter crash in northwestern Iran. Bloomberg's Bobby Ghosh says it appears to have been an accident.
This was a 3-helicopter convoy flying back towards Tehran, I gather, from the northwest of the country. It's a mountainous part of the country. There was bad weather, fog and rain, and these are very, very old helicopters. Remember, Iran has been under economic sanctions now for decades, and they have not had the access to parts and technologies. They certainly have not been able to buy new helicopters. So this is a very old craft flying in quite treacherous weather in very difficult terrain.
Bloomberg's Bobby Ghosh. The chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court says he is seeking arrest warrants for Israeli and Hamas leaders, including Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Karim Khan said today that he believes Netanyahu, his defense minister, and 3 Hamas leaders are responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Gaza Strip and Israel.
The crimes include starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, willfully causing great suffering, serious injury to body or health or cruel treatment, willful killing or murder, and intentionally directing attacks against a civilian population.
The prosecutor must request the warrants from a pretrial panel of 3 judges. An admission from Donald Trump's attorney and fixer Michael Cohen during the former president's criminal hush money trial. During defense cross-examination, Cohen says he stole from the Trump Organization. The judge in the trial now says closing arguments are not expected until next week due to the long Memorial Day weekend and other issues. Lawyers for the former president are not saying whether Trump himself will take the witness stand. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Paul, Alex, John.
All right, thank you so much, Michael Barr. So here's that breaking news from just a few moments ago. Ivan Boesky, who reached the pinnacle of fame and fortune as a high-flying Wall Street arbitrator, I didn't say that right, in the early 1980s, only to be exposed as a cheat in the insider trading scandal that defined the era, has now died. He was 87. The New York Times was the first to report his death, citing his daughter, Marianne Boesky. This is an amazing amazing end of this story. I don't remember it. I wasn't trading back then. I was in elementary school. But this defined sort of the Ivan the Terrible, the greed is good.
Yes.
This was the 80s, right?
Trading.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
sure.
Takeovers
and
junk fueled.
You know, there were any number of personalities involved in this. Robert Rubin, for instance, you've heard of him. And for our listeners, I know we have so many people who listen down at the Jersey Shore, and Rumson in particular. One of the folks who was caught up in that was a guy by the name of John Mulhern, who died some years ago in his early 50s. But he was a real presence on Wall Street, ran Bear Wagner, the specialist firm. But before that, he did ARB. Ivan Boesky had implicated him as well. And John, who at the time was on any number of medications for some serious illnesses, loaded up his Mercedes with a bunch of weapons and went to kill Ivan Boesky. Now, the family,
My gosh,
understandably upset about this, called the police. He was pulled over, arrested, whatever. Eventually, because of all the medications he was on, he was found not guilty. And he took that reputation as kind of nutty, maybe, and ran with it, and has opened an ice cream store at the foot of the Oceanic Bridge in Rumson. Crazies. So if you go by Crazies, that's the whole story behind that, and the linkage to Ivan Boesky.
That was the 1980s. Lots of crazy money, and it just kind of defined that 80s era. You know, just amazing. So Ivan Boesky dead at the age of.
Let's go get some ice cream.
That's
that
right.
tracks.
Balanced power right now.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
The president of Iran has died. What does it mean for U.S. policy in the Middle East? Welcome to the fastest show in politics, as we follow the latest on the death of President Raisi with Nick Wadhams, who runs our national security coverage. Of course, implications here throughout the region and the world. For the Biden White House, for the Pentagon, we'll keep an eye on Capitol Hill, where there could be a vote on the border this week. Yes, with more from the campaign trail, we'll sit down with Nancy Cook from Bloomberg Politics. And our panel today, Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Democratic analyst, joined by Chapin Fay, Republican strategist, now at Actum with the latest from Washington and around the world. We start, as always, on Wall Street and an update on trading with Charlie Pellet. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Joe Matthew. Indeed, stocks pushing higher right now with the Dow Jones Industrial Average at 40,023, up now by just under 0.1%. We've got the S&P up 17, S&P at 5321, up 0.3%, while the NASDAQ Composite Index up now by 0.7%. 10-year, 4.44%, with a 2-year that's now yielding 4.83%. Bitcoin up 2% now, 67,498 on Bitcoin. And West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.4%, 79.77 a barrel. Gold up 0.4%, 24.69 for an ounce of gold. Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic, one of a number of Fed speakers today. He spoke with Bloomberg Radio this morning, telling us the economy is slowing, and the economy is, the inflation is also coming down.
My outlook is really that inflation will continue to fall through this year and into 2025. You know, I think that it will take quite a while for us to get all the way to 2%, but I do think we'll get there. But of course, you know, the unexpected can always happen, and we've seen that through the last 3 or 4 years, where the pandemic was not expected, a war in Europe wasn't expected, and they do send ripples through the entire economy. If that happens, we'll just have to be ready and then respond as appropriate.
Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic. Well, the next big earnings event this week will be NVIDIA on Wednesday. It is an artificial intelligence bellwether. NVIDIA shares ahead of that report up today by 1.9%. Other chip makers, including Micron Technology, also advancing. Micron up 3.4%, upgraded to equal weight from underweight by Morgan Stanley. Again, recapping, S&P up 18, a gain there of 0.3%. Balance of power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, here's your host, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you. Welcome to the Monday edition of Balance of Power. Here we are again on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube, where you can search Bloomberg Global News and find our live stream there. We save a seat for you every day in the studio. Glad you're with us. With a very newsy weekend behind us and what could be a very newsy week. Donald Trump is back in court. Lawmakers are back in town. The president will join them a bit later on today. We expect votes on crypto this week. We expect a vote in the Senate on a border compromise. Not that anyone thinks it's going anywhere. And so we'll keep beating the drum here on messaging from Washington, with a lot more than messaging, however, coming out of the Middle East. Important story, of course, over the weekend, the death of Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi, a helicopter accident that was first deemed in headlines as a hard landing. It seemed to be a lot worse than that now, as we bring in the voice of Nick Wadhams, who's been at this for a couple of days here, runs our national security coverage, of course, in Washington, a regular voice on this program. Nick, this has been interesting. We've had a little bit of time here for this news to digest. In fact, we're already at the point now of talking about elections in Iran. How important is this politically for the United States? What's the reaction been here in Washington?
Well, the reaction in the U.S. has been very muted. We've basically seen almost nothing coming out from the administration. We should get more today in the daily round of press conferences. But, you know, I think the feeling really from the administration is that this does not actually change very much. The policy in Iran is set by the supreme leader. President Raisi was a hardliner, very much in line with Supreme Leader Khamenei, and it's the expectation now is that given moderates have been so sidelined in Iran, that whoever his replacement is not likely to change policy very much.
So I guess the continuity of government
correct
will be there. If this had been the supreme leader, we would be talking about a very different conversation here.
Yeah.
Our policy on Iran, therefore, is unchanged.
Yeah, and you know, the administration is such a delicate moment. I think the big thing they're waiting for is what does this mean for Iran in terms of, is there a possibility that Iran may want to send some signal in this moment, do not exploit our vulnerability, the upheaval, and do something incendiary or inflammatory, or do they essentially bunker down and say, okay, we are just going to focus on the elections? So I think you're seeing an administration that very much does not want to inflame the situation further, but obviously we'll be looking at what does this mean for Iranian support for proxies that have fueled some of the conflict with Israel. So a lot of questions.
That's right. Israel, of course. Look, are you surprised, and maybe it's my way of saying that I was surprised that there was not a knee-jerk and a thought toward Israeli involvement here?
Well, I mean, you know, the conspiracy theories always fly in a situation like that.
Were they flying?
There was a fair, you know, was it Israel? Was it an internal power struggle? I mean, you know, the other issue is you run up against the fact that I think rescuers were trudging through fog that at one point reached about 15 feet visibility. So it was extremely bad
blizzard
weather.
Conditions described as.
Blizzard conditions, mountainous terrain, a helicopter that dates back decades. Sanctions have made it impossible for Iran to get spare parts. So, you know, obviously there's much to be learned. I don't think there was a black box on this particular helicopter, but you never know. But it seems in this case like, you know, the obvious answer is probably the right one, that there was a technical malfunction on an old helicopter.
Is there a short list to replace him?
Yes, there is, and that succession plan is essentially already underway. But, you know, the real issue here is that the president almost needs no replacement because the supreme leader carries so much power and will dictate policy from now and into the future.
And will thumb the scale on his replacement?
No question. And, you know, the big question, though, is that, you know, Raisi was expected to be, or was seen as the likeliest candidate to succeed Supreme Leader Khamenei. So the bigger question now is, okay, well, who will take that position? Supreme Leader is quite old. He's in his mid-80s. There's the possibility that his son may come to the fore. But what you're seeing here, most interestingly to me, is not so much a question of succession around the presidency, because in some ways that is almost a ceremonial post, not quite, but a little bit. The real question is, what does this mean for the future of who becomes the next supreme leader?
To be clear, for those who don't follow this every day, these are two very different roles, and the president, in this case, the man who has died, was essentially in charge of the legislature. Is that fair to describe?
But all decisions stem from
anything that
the
matters.
supreme, anything really that matters. I mean, you can see a sort of moderating influence. Hussein Rouhani, previous president, had played a big role in pushing for the nuclear talks with the United States. But ever since those talks failed, and amid all of the war and the upheaval in the Middle East, I mean, there are really very few voices right now in Iran preaching moderation. It's a really hardline government. Those voices really rule the day.
We have a sense of timing on an election of 35
I think 50 days.
50 days, is that
is what will happen. So.
Thank you for coming in. I bet you were working all weekend on this. When that kind of stuff happens, the call goes to Nick Wadhams, and we thank you for joining, as always.
Sure.
With us here on Bloomberg, it's Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington as we turn our attention to the campaign trail and an important piece of writing that I want you to see on the terminal and online. And it comes from none other than Matt Winkler, our editor-in-chief emeritus, as we look specifically to Nevada for the contours of this campaign that are unfolding before our eyes. Nevada's swing state prosperity is no fluke, is the headline by Matthew Winkler, and he joins us right now from World Headquarters in New York. Mr. Winkler, it's always a pleasure to have you on the broadcast here, because we're talking about Nevada and the other 6 or 7 or so swing states that are going to decide this election every day around here. And when we see your fingerprints on it, it's important to us. With 3.2 million people, as you write, and 6 electoral college votes, Silver State outperformed the U.S. for the first time in its 160-year history since Biden entered the White House in 2021 by the combination of a record of manufacturing jobs and an increase in non-farm payrolls. If the economy lifts all boats, is Joe Biden on one of them?
It sure looks that way. And the best way to say that is that Nevada is the true economic bellwether in terms of performance. It's outperforming the U.S. economy through a combination of manufacturing job creation, record 69,600, and a 22% increase in non-farm payrolls since Biden took office. That has never happened before in the 160-year history of Nevada.
What do you make of polls? And we've got our own, we've got Siena College out. Just last week, we talked to Don Levy from Siena, showing Joe Biden with quite a deficit here. But we've also got a long way to go.
Yeah, I mean, look, polls are a snapshot. They're a perception. And where I come from in journalism, it's called follow the facts. And, you know, what do people do? What has happened to their lives? And if anyone did any reporting of what's happened to people's lives in the past 3.5 years, they would see that Nevada has, you know, not only outperformed the rest of the U.S., but people's lives in Nevada are better. By the way, the very same poll that you quoted, when they asked those very same people, how are you doing? Almost 75% of them say they're very satisfied with where they are. So that tells you a great deal, I think. And I think journalists, if they exclude the facts, they're missing a big part of reality.
Well, look, this is the conundrum that we're in right now, with a lot of questions, of course, about the sample, about whether people are being honest, and about how much time remains in this cycle. People look at things differently when they're closer to an election than when they're further away from it. I have to ask you, though, about organized labor. Matt, we've talked so much about Joe Biden's relationship with the UAW, for instance, and his endorsement from organized labor in Detroit, whether that will materialize in the rank and file. You look at the culinary workers alone on the Las Vegas Strip and the power that they have to choose the next president. Is that going for Joe Biden?
Well, of course. I mean, he's the first president to actually stand with labor on the picket line. So if that's all he did, that's a superlative. But it goes much deeper than that. He's really been about, as he says, improving the lot of people with manufacturing or what we call working class jobs. And if you, again, you look at the data, the interesting part of our rebound from COVID-19 and the worst recession since the Great Depression is that the bottom part of the economy in terms of wage growth and compensation has improved more than the top. And again, we haven't seen that trend really at all in the 21st century. So, to the extent that Biden has signed legislation, policies that have changed the trajectory of the economy of particularly people historically disadvantaged, minorities in particular, but people who have had what we call working class jobs, that should make a big difference.
It's interesting because Nevada, of course, always feels the worst for some reason of an economic downturn. We think of housing back in 2007. We think of COVID and the shutdown of Las Vegas, of all of those hotels, the tens of thousands of hotel jobs, hospitality workers, culinary workers who we've already referred to, the drivers in Las Vegas, Matt. When they think back to where they were 4 years ago, is that going to make a difference?
Well, I think it will. The unemployment rate right now in Nevada is 5.1%. That's way below the long-term average. And if you just did a comparison of where the state is today and its measures of well-being, which the Philadelphia Federal Reserve does a very good job doing because they factor in such things as inflation in their measure. And the performance of the economy under Biden the past 3 years is superior to the performance of Trump. And even if you took out, if you like, the year that was COVID, 2020, it still is an overwhelming rebound by comparison to where Nevada has been historically. So yeah, I think as we get closer to the election, these are the facts. They're going to have to be shared widely, but once they are shared, it should make a difference.
It sounds to me that if you sat down with the Biden campaign, you'd tell them to spend their money and resources somewhere else. The president has much greater challenges on his hands when it
but what I have done, and my colleague Champagne and I have done, is because our profession has so inadequately reported or underreported the 7 so-called swing states, Nevada included. What we've decided to do one by one is go and take a look at each of these states: Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina, Georgia, Nevada, of course, and Pennsylvania. In doing so, what we're seeing is a trend across the board. It's not all the same, but what it is showing is that the economies of all of these states, when we get to them, is very different and very much better than it was before. And unfortunately, there isn't a lot of local reporting, and the national reporting is, as you said, totally caught up with the polls. Whenever there's a poll story, it leads the news. And to us, that's not really what's happening. What's happening is what happened to people's lives, what happened to their work, their workplaces, and their well-being, and so on. And we see in the 7 swing states that actually it's a pretty good scenario.
I only have a minute, and God forbid I have to cut off the editor-in-chief emeritus at Bloomberg. I'm just curious, because it sounds like you see a Joe Biden victory. Do you think it will be a close one?
You know, that is not something that I'm qualified to discuss or
Well, I'm attracted by the fact that you will not answer that.
But I am.
Honesty is attractive.
No,
I think
I'll answer your question. I do think he's going to win.
Yeah?
But I think he's going to win in part because we're still not paying attention to somebody who at this point is totally unqualified to be president. I don't know why we're not reporting on that. I mean, he's twice impeached. He's convicted of what do you want to call it? Adjudicated rape. That should be every parenthetical clause in our discussion of the election. I think as we get closer, maybe it will be. But one candidate is normal, the other candidate is completely abnormal.
Matt Winkler, Bloomberg Editor-in-Chief Emeritus, thank you for the column and for the time. You'll obviously hear voices who see this differently here on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.
Okay, today I'm going to talk about how to succeed with a startup. Obviously, more than can be said here in 20 minutes, but I will do the best I can. The most important thing, the number one lesson we try to teach startups is that the degree to which you're successful approximates the degree to which you build a product that is so good, people spontaneously tell their friends about it. Startups always ask us for the secret to success. They always want to believe it's something other than this, because this is really hard to do. But this is it. If you can build a product that is so good, people spontaneously tell their friends about it, you have done 80% of the work that you need to be a really successful startup. If you think about the most successful companies you know, Google, Facebook, whatever, you probably found out about them because a friend of yours said, you got to try this, it's great. So this is the bar. Something that people love so much they tell their friends about it. One important indicator for a product like that is a product that's simple to explain and easy to understand. If you can't explain in a few words what you do, and if at least some people don't say, oh, that's pretty interesting, that's usually a mistake. It's usually a sign of unclear thinking or a need that is not big enough.
I want a bank that shows me what I spend instantly. We're Monzo. Give us a go.
See? Well, I want a bank that can help me budget for the things I need, like a new leather jacket for Bingo.
We can do that.
Bingo's my cockapoo.
Hi, Bingo.
It's a real faff to sign up.
It takes less than 10 minutes.
Race you.
You're on. Time's up. How'd you get on?
It's a draw.
Is it? We hear you, Bingo. You make Monzo Monzo.
Hi, I'm Laurie Haynes, CEO and co-founder of Shirar, and I'm really excited to tell you that we are going to be raising funds for Shirar again. After a successful raise in 2023, it's time to scale.
We hope that you enjoy the pitch deck and the financial model. Any questions, please don't hesitate to ask us, and we can't wait for you to be part of Shirar.
things are fine in the world. Everyone survived the weekend when you see Charlie on the market update. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Welcome to Balance of Power. The fastest show in politics carries on here with an eye on the Trump campaign. Yes, he's back in court today, and there was a thought, by the way, that we were wrapping this thing up in the middle of this week. They thought this would be the last day of Michael Cohen on the stand. We're hearing now that closing arguments, in fact, will move into next week. So maybe a week from today or tomorrow, we're talking about this trial wrapping up here, and then we can get on with the impact that it may or may not have on the campaign trail. One thing we're always looking at, though, is who's showing up, right? Where's the entourage today? I haven't heard any bold-faced names making their way to the courtroom. I guess now everyone knows they have a minute. Lawmakers, of course, will be back in town for some important stuff this week, and we'll get to that later. Nancy Cook joins us right now. Of course, Bloomberg's national political correspondent, senior national political correspondent, who's been inside and out with the Trump campaign, going back to the Trump White House. And we'll be curious to see if she has an opportunity to cover a Trump White House again. It's nice to see you at the table, as always.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Are you compelled, before I ask you about your reason why you're actually in here in this great column you have on everyone trying to get a piece of Donald Trump, are you compelled by who's showing up at court? Because you know all these people. Is this a game for you, or are you thinking about who hasn't attended yet?
Well, I mean, I think that I think Trump is thinking about who hasn't and putting gold stars next to the names of people who have come. I mean, loyalty has always been a huge thing with him.
Yeah.
And sort of feeling like people are standing by him in his lowest moments is a very key thing for him. And you know, he views people who stood by him after January 6th as really loyal, or, you know, who stood by him at a number of low points in his campaign. Right. And so he will definitely be watching, you know, who ended up showing up in this court case outside as surrogates to support him and what they said. And he will be highly attuned to that sort of for the next 6 months.
Is this being orchestrated by invitation? Does the campaign invite somebody, or, you know, does a Mike Johnson say, hey, I think I can be there Tuesday. Would that be a good time to come? I'll bring friends. How does this come together? Because it looks like it's choreographed pretty well.
It is choreographed well, and we've seen the campaign use this on a number of occasions. They did this in the primary. They did this in the Iowa State Fair.
Okay.
It's like a way for them to show a lot of strength and sort of strength in numbers. And it's sort of a mix. Some people volunteer, say, hey, I'm happy to come. Others, you know, they're sort of reaching out to. But it is really choreographed with the communications team and some top Trump people, because they want his surrogates there in mass. It's almost like at this point, having covered him since 2015, you know, he really likes to travel with an entourage. It's almost like a MAGA cafeteria or group of people that go with him everywhere. I mean, I just say this, I saw this in Iowa, I saw this in New Hampshire. You know, now we're seeing this outside of the court and in the court, and it's interesting that this is how he rolls at this point.
It sure is. I don't know what he's going to do when he comes out of this trial, but I suspect he'll want to seize on the moment. When its conclusion is a moment, he knows how to turn these moments to his benefit. Has there been any talk inside the campaign about a news conference or a big Mar-a-Lago event or something to say the trial's done?
I think that they haven't sort of landed on anything, but they have been thinking about ways to use his court cases to their political advantage since September, you know, really since last fall. And that has been a key part of the campaign strategy, sort of how to fuse these legal challenges with a political campaign. And they have thought extensively about it. You know, often we see things at Mar-a-Lago, sort of a celebration, you know, where the allies come. I don't know
frequently on his worst day.
Sure. So I don't know. I don't know if we'll end up doing that, or if it will just be something in New York. You know, it could just be something where he sort of comes out and does a stop in New York because he's already there. We'll have to see.
We haven't heard that he's liking being back at Trump Tower, right? He's not going to move back to Manhattan anytime soon, I guess.
No. He's going to stick with his routine
of curious
Mar-a-Lago and Bedminster.
Yeah, that's the life.
You know, he would love to win New York politically, you know, during the in November, but I think that, you know, he's sort of done with New York a little bit.
So you're writing about all of the inputs that Donald Trump is enjoying right now, and I guess that would be the case for any front-runner presumptive nominee. Trump gets pitched on tax cuts, tariffs by competing ex-advisors. It's the last part of that, the headline on Nancy's piece, that's interesting here, because a lot of people think Donald Trump wants to hear from them, and a lot of people think that Donald Trump should hear from them. Beyond making the 2017 tax cuts permanent, we're hearing about an entire sort of new construct for government. What is Donald Trump hearing from his ex-advisors?
So basically, the story makes the point that there are a number of very top advisors from the White House, Treasury, World Bank, like every major agency out there developing plans about what would happen if he took office. And those conversations range from like what to do with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, how high should tariffs on China be, you know, what should we do on healthcare, what should we do on financial regulation. There is like a very sophisticated, large group of people, high-level individuals and also think tanks that are thinking through this. And it's not that Trump has like signed off on everything. It's not that they've asked for every one of these things, but there is sort of, I would say at this point, like a shadow administration sort of growing out there and coming up with these plans because, you know, the polls show him and Biden locked in a very tight race and they want him to be ready if he wins.
These ideas are sometimes leaking into news. We saw the idea of Donald Trump remaking the Fed to include the commander-in-chief more directly, stories like that, where it's not always clear Donald Trump knew about that plan. Do you have a sense of how often he's being briefed, for lack of a better word, or part of these brainstorming sessions?
That's a great question. So I think that there are a lot of informal conversations happening between him and his top campaign advisors and these sort of ex-economic officials. I think that, you know, they have the benefit of leaning on these people for the expertise, but because they're not part of the campaign, they have plausible deniability with the more fringe ideas like he should oversee the Fed. You know, they were not happy with that story.
Right.
But it's sort of the best of both worlds for them because it gives them a lot of flexibility if he wins. But I will also say that, you know, there is someone on the campaign, Vince Haley, who is coordinating all the policy. He is a campaign aide, and he often reaches out to this network of informal aides saying, you know, for instance, hey, former President Trump's going to Detroit, and we're going to talk about cars. What should we say there? So, like, I don't, you know, the campaign uses these people as a sounding board and takes their input. And so they try to act like these people are never involved. They distance themselves from the ideas that they don't like. However, they're out there and they use them.
Well, it's an interesting way to float a balloon.
It
is.
is.
He might find some successful ideas that way as well. Just like he does riffing at the podium. And we saw him do a couple of stem winders over the weekend. Do you watch all of these still, or do you just know the stump speech? You can look at the highlights. I always think of Nancy when I'm watching these Trump rallies. He did one at the NRA. I forget where the other one was this weekend. And I'm bringing this up because there was a lot of stuff. You know, the Trump show is something that's tried and true. There are a lot of things that we're used to, the QAnon music, everything else that's happening. But he had a couple of moments. At one point, he almost fell off the podium, and it looked like a pretty rickety podium for what it's worth, and he blamed the contractor. I can't imagine what his night was like or hers. In the other speech, though, at the NRA, he froze up, it seemed like, or at least stopped talking for 33 seconds. It's a long period of time. And it struck me that if either of those had happened to Joe Biden, those would be big stories today.
Absolutely.
How come they're not for Donald Trump?
Well, I think that what we're facing, I mean, one, it happened on the Saturday, so I think, you know, not everyone's paying attention on the weekends. But then the other thing is that, you know, what we're really facing is two men running for president. One's in his late 70s, one in his early 80s. And I think that they both deserve scrutiny about sort of their mental and physical acuity and whether they're up to the job. And they both have made mistakes or gaffes. You know, the campaigns sort of get furious when reporters point them out. But I think it's a legit question, you know, for both of them.
Well, and we'll see if people are asking it, I guess, as we move our way through the cycle. But the Biden campaign isn't going to go there because it just reminds people of Joe Biden's issues, right?
Right, and I think that, you know, what Trump tries to do is, you know, he says outlandish things all the time, but he tries to project himself as more energetic than Biden, and that is sort of how that they are dealing with it. But the age question is a really tricky question for both of them.
Well, that's for sure.
And whether or not they, you know, we see it even in how they plan their schedule. You know, neither one of them is going to be barnstorming the country, you know, like a 50-year-old presidential candidate would be over the summer. You know, they're both going to keep lighter schedules.
Are we sure we're getting debates? Do you believe these agreements that we're told are going to happen in June and what is it, September?
I believe that they've scheduled them. I will believe that they're going to happen.
When are you convinced?
When it's 8 p.m. on debate night and I know that both of them are in the building.
You need to see it to believe it.
Well, I just think, you know, a lot can happen between now and the end of June.
I think this is really important. Everyone needs to remember. That's Nancy Cook talking, guys. Come on. Great to see you in here on the early edition, too, of Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Great to have you with us as well. Find Nancy's piece, by the way. Trump gets pitched tax cuts, tariffs by competing ex-advisors. It's on the terminal right now on Bloomberg.com. We'll assemble our panel next. Jeannie is with us, and so is Chapin Fay today after we get up to date on world and national news. For that, we turn to Amy Morris in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Amy.
Hi, Joe. Ex-Trump lawyer Michael Cohen is admitting that he stole from the Trump Organization. Cohen made the admission he stole $30 grand from the company while on the stand today in Trump's hush money case in New York. Cohen is the prosecutor's key witness. Meanwhile, the trial could take longer to get to the jury than expected. The judge told the jury this morning that closing arguments, originally expected for tomorrow, might not begin until next Tuesday. Israel hopes the White House and Congress will condemn the ICC action seeking arrest warrants of Israeli officials, including Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Israeli officials say the move is political, hypocritical, and anti-Semitic. The chief prosecutor at the International Criminal Court is seeking arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar on war crimes charges. We get the very latest from Bloomberg's Sean Coach in our newsroom in Amsterdam.
The panel of International Criminal Court judges will have to consider whether or not to accept the application. But it's absolutely a controversial decision because it comes it comes despite a U.S. warning that it could jeopardize the chance for a ceasefire deal.
Bloomberg's Khan Koch reporting from Amsterdam. Iran President Ibrahim Raisi was killed in a helicopter crash in Iran's northern mountains. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer overnight said there was no evidence of foul play.
It looks like an accident. There was very bad foggy weather in northwest Iran where the copter crashed.
Iran is set for an election in the next 50 days. First Vice President Mohammad Mokhbar has temporarily taken over as interim president. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow lower, the S&P, NASDAQ. They are both pushing higher to records. S&P right now at 53.20, up by 0.3%. Dow Industrials back below 40,000, 39,988 right now on the Dow, down less than 0.1%. S&P up 0.3%. NASDAQ up 119, a gain there of 0.7%. 10-year yield 4.44%. The 2-year 4.83%. Spot gold up 0.5%, up $11 the ounce to $24.26. While West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.6%, $79.55 for a barrel of WTI. Bottom line here, stock market trading at records only a few days ahead of results from NVIDIA, the last of the so-called Magnificent Seven companies to report. The Fed releases policy meeting minutes this week as Fed officials signal they will hold rates at a 2-decade high. And with more, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
The minutes will cover the April-May policy session, and Bloomberg Economics says they could show this year's inflation breakout has dashed confidence among Fed officials. In comments today, the Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic told Bloomberg Radio that U.S. inflation will take longer to moderate, perhaps into next year. Bostic also says nothing has changed regarding his view that only one Fed rate cut would be appropriate this year. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
J.P. Morgan Chase is raising its forecast for this year's net interest income, its biggest source of revenue, on expectations the Federal Reserve will lower rates at a slower pace than the bank previously predicted. We've got J.P. Morgan Chase shares down now by 2.2%. Recapping, S&P up 17, up 0.3%. Balance of power continues now. And once again, here's your host, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie, thank you. It's good to see Charlie Pellet here. And you can too if you're with us on YouTube. Search Bloomberg Global News as we straddle our D.C. and New York bureaus here on the fastest show in politics. We're going to assemble our panel coming up. Jeannie Shanzano and Chapin Fay with us today as we absorb new numbers, new polling data from the campaign trail surrounding a very important issue here. CBS News is out with a poll finding abortion access seeing wide support around the country, and that has been consistent in research that we have talked about here. We'll dig into that poll with reproductive rights, of course, such a huge factor in this cycle. 2 Republican senators are up with a bill now to protect in vitro fertilization after the Alabama Supreme Court got this whole conversation starting, ruling that embryos created by IVF are in fact children. The state legislature acted to overturn that ruling. But those 2 Republican senators, Ted Cruz and Katie Britt, sat down to talk about their legislation in an op-ed this morning to support the bill with Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern. And I want to bring you part of that conversation here before we assemble our panel. Anne-Marie referring to the fact that the Supreme Court ruling was in fact addressed by the legislature. So why would a national bill be required? Here's what we heard, starting with Katie Britt.
Unfortunately, we've seen a number of people try to fearmonger on this very issue. And so Ted and I came together, and we believe this effort should be bipartisan to make sure that every parent across the country who wants to bring life into this world and maybe struggling with infertility or others, but wants to use IVF to create the miracle of life, bring it into the world, has a certainty that that's going to be available to them. And so we're excited about it and believe that it's something we can move forward quickly.
Senator Cruz, then why wouldn't Republicans sign up for Senator Duckworth's bill earlier this year, which then actually would have protected what happened in Alabama?
Well, because that bill's a very different bill. That bill really seeks to backdoor in broader abortion legislation, which is where the Democrats are, but that's not IVF. Our bill is very simple and it's very focused, and it is designed to protect IVF. IVF is miraculous medical technology. It enables millions of parents to have children, to be moms, to be dads. 2% of live births in America right now today come from IVF. It's incredible. And both Katie and I agree that IVF is incredibly pro-family, that we should be standing and helping parents who want to raise kids. And what happened when the Alabama Supreme Court decision came out, there was a lot of confusion, there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of misunderstanding, and people did not want anything to threaten IVF. I agree with that. Katie agrees with that. And so we came together and said, let's draft a simple, straightforward federal bill that creates a federal right, that you as a parent have a right to have access to IVF. If you want to have a child and you need medical assistance to do so, that should be your right. This is a bill, I think, that should be overwhelmingly bipartisan. The Senate should pass this bill 100-0. We'll see if they do or not, but on the merits, that's what should happen.
Not too many bills passed 100-0 there. That's Ted Cruz, Katie Britt in New York today with Anne-Marie Hordern to talk about a bill that they see as being critical, of course, to righting the ship on messaging from the Republican Party on this, as you just heard from Katie Britt herself. We've seen a number of people, she said, try to fearmonger on this very issue. Let's assemble our panel for their take on this, and I'm glad we have some time to take a deep dive with Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributor and senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Of course, Bloomberg Politics contributor, joined by Chapin Fay, Republican strategist, managing director at Actum. Great to see you both here. Chapin, I'm going to start with you because you're the Republican on the panel today, and I wonder the extent to which you are concerned that there is confusion when it comes to messaging around reproductive rights, thanks to what we saw happen in Alabama.
Listen, I think there's confusion around a lot of issues these days. But you bring up a good point on this issue. It's such a flashpoint for this country, right? It has been for a long time. It seems to be getting even worse, meaning, you know, the people who are pro-life and the people who are pro-choice are not even talking about the same issue, right? They're talking about different issues, which is why they can't communicate. It's always been a problem, issues and messaging-wise on abortion. You know, the pro-choice messaging is about a woman's right to choose, and pro-life is about, you know, people talking about viability of the baby and the fetus. So they're really talking past each other. So I'm not surprised that they're continuing to do so, especially at this high level. And I do think this IVF issue really complicates things because I think that doesn't cut cleanly on pro-choice, pro-life, Democrat, Republican lines. And that's why I think you're seeing a lot of Republicans now talking about that particular piece of it. But I am a little, you know, it mattered particularly in New York, in places like New York, where abortion, where pro-choice language matters. And it is an important issue. It matters electorally. It may not matter everywhere, but it will matter in swing districts. There are a lot in New York. There's going to be a lot of focus on New York. So the abortion issue is going to play for the Democrats for sure.
Jeannie, what do you make of Cruz and Britt going to this extent, co-authoring an op-ed, sitting down with interviewers in New York to deliver this message now, even after the legislature in Alabama acted?
Yeah, I think it just shows how much the Republican Party is struggling with the mess they created when it comes to women's health and reproductive rights in this country. We've seen it from the top, from former President Trump, all the way down the ballot, where they've lost many of the elections since the decision in Dobbs. And it continues because now you see them wrapping themselves up in a pretzel to try to say on this issue, the national government should step in, but not on others. And I was so glad Anne-Marie asked about Senator Duckworth's bill, because, you know, that is the question, right? You know, Senator Duckworth put that forward. It didn't get the support it should have. And now there, you know, you have Cruz saying this one should get 100. Well, the reality is the choice of what to do with your body should be left to the individual, in this case, the woman, and her doctor and family members who care about and love them. Not Ted Cruz, not Katie Britt, not anybody else, but that. And they opened a can of worms with Dobbs, and now they're trying to put the worms back in the can, and it's going to be very difficult.
CBS News polling on this issue, among others, well, including the horse race as well. They looked at Arizona and Florida in this most recent survey, came out over the weekend. Donald Trump, by the way, up 5 in the hypothetical, which is not so hypothetical anymore, but in the direct matchup in Arizona. In Florida, Trump up by 9. But Chapin, they looked at a lot of other issues, including abortion. And abortion access found wide support in this poll. It still trails inflation and the border as issues of priority overall for Americans. How do you put these together in what Republicans should be messaging for the next 6 months?
Well, economic issues have always polled as the number one issue, typically, generally speaking, from local races up to presidential. So I'm not surprised that inflation is number one. I do think that's the most important messaging for Republicans. I do think abortion messaging is tricky in many places for Republicans. It's not typically an issue.
So do you talk about it, Chapin, or do you just keep hitting the economy every day?
I think it depends on the candidate and the issue or the race, but I think you hit the top issues. I think you hit, there are plenty of issues now from Republican perspective. If you look at today versus whether you were better off 4 years ago, I mean, there's more wars, the border, the economy, inflation. I mean, there's a lot of things you could talk about. So if you don't have to talk about abortion, I don't think you should. If you're in a place where the public's views are against your views, right? That you don't lead with it, right? A lot of Republicans in New York are pro-life, but they don't lead with that. They don't talk necessarily about that in their campaigns, particularly in certain swing districts. So that would be my advice. I mean, there are plenty of issues that are ringing. It will work for the Democrats. If I were advising Democrats, just like in New York, I think it gave Lee Zeldin some real problems when he was running for governor. When that came, when the leak from the Supreme Court came about overturning Roe v. Wade. So I do think the Democrats are going to make an issue out of it. It's up to Republicans to sort of stay close to the electorate and what they care about, and also talk about the issues that are better for them.
Well, as we stick with these three issues, Jeannie, I'm fascinated by what Democrats are doing with the border this week in the Senate. Chuck Schumer is going to bring the border compromise that was originally part of the emergency spending request for Ukraine, Israel, and fell out in the Senate, DOA in the House. Remember all that? He's bringing it to the floor this week. It's not expected to pass. Is this smart strategy for him to call people on the carpet on this with Jeannie?
It is. I think it's important to remind people the reason why it crashed. It was one of the strongest bills we've seen in decades. We heard Senator Peters talking about this over the weekend, and it was Donald Trump who pulled the plug because, of course, he didn't want Joe Biden to get a win. And so Chuck Schumer is trying to remind people, I don't know if it's going to work. There's a lot of noise out there politically, so I don't know if it will work, but it's important to remind people. But I think for Joe Biden and the Democrats, they have to embrace a couple things. I mean, Joe, you used the word, and it is the exact right word. There is a consistency to these polls that we're seeing. And there is something that is, as much as I say all the time, oh, this is such an unusual election. It's not unusual in a lot of ways. Yes, we have a former president, potentially facing jail time. Beyond that, it is, in keeping with what we see a lot of times, economy, economy, economy. So the Biden team has got to stop telling people about the job numbers. I mean, they can say it, but they've got to talk about people where they live, which is prices feel too darn high, and we are going to do something about that. I mean, that has got to be the message. And of course, then to talk about what Donald Trump would do with that. And he told us not that long ago that he would trade a lot of this for $1 billion from the oil executives, for instance. So there's a lot they can say, but they've got to meet people where they are. And it's maddening when they start trying to tell people that the numbers look good. Because, you can't talk people into something they're not feeling when they go to the grocery store.
Yeah, well, that's for sure. Chapin, this is an interesting maneuver, bringing the border bill to the floor, knowing it's not going to pass. We see this happen a lot in Washington. Let's force them to vote, put your name on it. Chuck Schumer wants to help Democrats running for re-election in states where the border is a top issue. Think John Tester in Montana, Sherrod Brown in Ohio. I could keep on going. Does the real world work like this, though? Are there independent voters out there saying, look at that, they voted for this border thing, I'm actually going to vote for the Democrat here?
I think it matters a little bit, right? The Democrats will certainly try and message that, try and get that benefit out of it for sure. And when Republicans are in charge, they do the same thing. I mean, that's I don't know if that's how the real world works, but that's how the political world works, which, as we know, is oftentimes doesn't align closely with the real world.
Sure.
But listen, it's a smart play for the Democrats, right? This is an election year, so we're about to come into the real silly season. You're going to see a lot of votes that may not make sense to the average person when you really read an article about it, but makes sense politically, right? The Democrats want Republicans to take bad votes, and the Republicans who don't have as much legislative power are going to try and do the same thing. You'll probably see a lot of that in the House. And it does matter, to answer your question, it does matter a little bit, right? Someone may read an article about it, and, there is an independent voter who might say, take one way out of it, and that's the issue that they see. The only thing I would conclude with is, you asked that question last time we spoke. We were talking about how the independent voter is actually getting slimmer and slimmer and slimmer, the margins.
That's right.
And they're all fighting over like less than 10%. Both campaigns are fighting over less than 10% in all of these swing states because both with Biden and Trump, their name ID, everything is sort of baked in, right? I don't know if anyone's Googling whether Trump supports that bill or not, right? That's already baked in. It really is the folks who may not be paying attention. They're just trying to put food on the table, send their kids to school, and then they're going to read some articles in the lead up to the election, right? Those are the voters that they're both fighting for desperately because the margins are so small. So to answer your question, sorry, it does matter a little bit.
Yeah, this is what it's going to come down to. We could put these people, there are so few of them, put them in one stadium. Let's settle the election tonight. Chapin Fay, Jeannie Shanzano, a great panel. They'll be back with us in hour 2 for a lot more of our discussion, and we'll find Kaylee Lines in the process. Stay with us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
balance of power. Live from Washington, D.C.
The cross-examination of Michael Cohen has ended, but Donald Trump's criminal trial in New York will bleed into another week. Welcome to the fastest show in politics. As Donald Trump begins another week in court today, I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington. And Kaylee, it's looking like closing arguments will have to wait until after the holiday weekend.
Indeed. We thought that we might see closing arguments tomorrow, Tuesday, and instead it's going to wait until next Tuesday. Get through Memorial Day. That is when both the defense and the prosecution will have their final word before things are sent to the jury. And we could find out in a matter of just 2 weeks or so here, Joe, whether or not Donald Trump ends up a convicted felon.
That's the moment we're at. Not a huge entourage of lawmakers today. I guess Alan Dershowitz is the celebrity guest on this episode here. Really interesting, though. Cross-examination has ended for Donald Trump's former fixer. Redirect is underway right now. We have Jim Zirin with us to help us make sense of this today in New York.
Yeah, former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. Looking forward to that conversation. Plus, we have to check in on what Joe Biden has been up to. He, of course, gave a commencement address at Morehouse College down in Georgia over the weekend. So Bloomberg's Laura Davison will be with us in just a few minutes. First, though, as always, let's get a check on the markets. Charlie Pellet up in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Kaylee and Joe. Here's what's going on. We're looking at a mixed market right now. Dow Industrials trading lower. We've got the S&P, NASDAQ both higher, not just higher, but also at records. Right to the numbers. S&P up 17 right now, a gain of 0.3%. The Dow down 36, down just about 0.1%, while NASDAQ up 132, a gain there of 0.8%. 10-year yield at 4.43%, with a 2-year right now 4.83%. Spot gold up 0.5%, 24.26 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.6%, 79.56 for a barrel of WTI. The big earnings event this week, NVIDIA on Wednesday. It's an artificial intelligence bellwether. NVIDIA shares, they're pushing higher now by 2.7%. Also, Micron Technology advancing up 4% right now. Micron upgraded to equal weight from underweight by Morgan Stanley. Again, recapping, a mixed market right now. The Dow lower, S&P higher, S&P up 0.3 at 53.21. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines.
All right, Charlie Pellet up in New York. Thank you so much. New York, of course, Joe, where Donald Trump has had to spend most of his days over the course of the many weeks since April 15th when his criminal hush money trial began. But we could be closing in on the end of the amount of time he'll have to spend in New York. Not this week, but next Tuesday. Closing arguments, according to Judge Merchan in this case, are set.
Yeah, I guess the jury will have a long holiday weekend, hopefully along with you as well, not sequestered as they deliberate until next week. So this will be interesting. Not that I expect a sequester. That's probably not going to happen in this case. But interesting to watch Michael Cohen wrap up his testimony here because it's unclear, Kaylee, who's going to come next.
Yeah, there's a question around FEC official, former one, whether he could testify on the part of the defense, because the defense would like to make clear what exactly the rules are here, I guess. But it seems that there's been a lot of back and forth with the judge and what in terms is actually permissible of testimony from that witness. And of course, we also still have the question around Donald Trump himself, whether he takes the stand. Most experts would tell you he won't.
These are the big questions we pose to Jim Zirin, I'm glad to say, is back with us from World Headquarters in New York, former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. Jim, it's great to see you. Thank you, as always, for joining us. I'd love to know your thoughts on whether Donald Trump would, maybe should, or two different questions here, testify. But first, let's talk about Michael Cohen. As he survives cross-examination and is now going through redirect. They're actually, I guess, in a lunch break at the moment, which gives us a good chance to take note of where we are. How did Donald Trump's defense attorneys do here in trying to frame the narrative around someone they say is a witness with no credibility?
Well, I think they landed a few blows and perhaps showed some inconsistencies. They also brought out something which had been brought out on direct examination, that Cohen had stolen money from Trump. But all that simply goes to the ultimate issue of credibility, which is for the jury. On cross-examination, defense lawyers often score some points. The witness, Cohen, is now on redirect. Susan Hoffinger is a terrific prosecutor. And I assume she's going to bring out through questioning Cohen's clarifying testimony about the famous telephone conversation that he claims he had with Trump when the text messages show that they were discussing some other subject. There were many other telephone conversations, the October 26th conversations, notably, that Cohen had with Trump. And the basic point is that Trump approved of the payment to Stormy Daniels and approved of it being delivered to Stormy Daniels in the way that it was, with the circumstances of concealment.
So, Jim, as we think about whether or not ultimately the jury is going to find Michael Cohen to be credible and trustworthy as it formulates its thought process on exactly whether Donald Trump should be acquitted or convicted of these crimes, would any further testimony from witnesses the defense calls ultimately matter, assuming one of them is not going to be Donald Trump? What does an FEC expert witness have to do with whether or not Michael Cohen told the truth?
It's not going to really affect the credibility of Michael Cohen, and there are a number of witnesses they might call whom they're not going to call. They're really the only person who can contradict Cohen is someone whom the jury won't believe either, and that's Donald Trump. And if he takes the stand, he'll be subjected to vigorous cross-examination, and he'll have to commit perjury to deny that he knew about the reimbursement of payment. He can be asked a series of questions that he really can't answer without incriminating himself, such as, you signed 9 checks, you're a micromanager, right? Right? And you sign checks unless you know what they're for? No, not usually. And did you see the invoices that related to those checks? No, I didn't. I show you the invoices. They say they were for legal services from Michael Cohen. What legal services did Cohen render to you? It was supposed to be pursuant to a retainer agreement. Where's the retainer agreement? And Trump can't answer those questions without incriminating himself. And so most lawyers would say it's an act of malpractice if they call him to the stand, because he'll just dig himself in much deeper.
You wrote a fascinating opinion piece in The Hill about this, Jim, in which you say that Donald Trump likely will not take the stand, but if he does not, as most people believe, there will always be the suspicion in people's minds about why he chose not to. Is this a real conversation, you think, inside his legal team right now?
Well, there are 2 courts that are considering the guilt or innocence of Donald Trump. One is the Court of Justice on Center Street in downtown Manhattan, and the other is the Court of Public Opinion. In the Court of Justice, the prosecution is not permitted to comment on the defendant's failure to take the stand. In fact, the judge can charge the jury that they draw no inference from his failure to take the stand, although judges frequently talk to defense counsel before they even give such a charge. The prosecutor can say that you heard the evidence presented by Michael Cohen. It's largely corroborated, and none of it is contradicted. And that will have a telling effect on the jury. In the Court of Public Opinion, the political court, it certainly ought to weigh strongly with voters who haven't already committed themselves that Donald Trump did not take the stand and never denied the charge that he made this secret payment of hush money to Stormy Daniels in order to influence the outcome of the 2016 election. That's the charge on which the jury will deliberate.
And of course, Jim, we also know, based on polling, including polling Bloomberg has done with Morning Consult in the past, that if he becomes a convicted felon, especially in swing states, voters may be less likely to vote for him. So it just does become a question of whether ultimately that conviction happens. How difficult is it going to be, in your mind, given all of the testimony that has been heard, the arguments have been made, for this to not end up, say, in a hung jury or even an acquittal?
Well, the jurors will be instructed that what they bring to the courtroom is not their biases, not their political leanings, not their attitudes as to whether they like or dislike Donald Trump, but their common sense. And if you look at the totality of these transactions, they were only accomplished for one purpose, and that was to benefit Donald Trump, to shut up Stormy Daniels on the run-up to the election, and to make sure she stayed silent until after the election was over, because the timing was such that it came on the heels of the Billy Bush tape, and Trump just couldn't take another sex scandal, according to his advisors in the Trump campaign. Now, the jury understands that, and in closing arguments, you can be sure the prosecutors will make them understand that. They're going to return a verdict of guilty after hearing the judge's instructions.
I wonder your thoughts on duration here, the extent to which jurors need time. I know that deliberations can take on a lot of different forms here. Jim, when this goes to the jury, how long will we wait?
Well, it's hard to say. I think if it's going to be an acquittal, they could come back within an hour. If they're mulling over the various 34 counts and mulling over the evidence and asking for the testimony of witnesses to be read back to them, or if they're asking for exhibits, it's more likely to lean toward a conviction. If it goes on too long, the judge may deliver to the jury the famous Allen charge. Allen was a case in the Supreme Court of the United States in 1896. And the Allen charge, which is sometimes called the dynamite charge, basically tells the minority jurors, without probing what the vote is at that point, that they have to follow their consciences and come to a conscientious conclusion individually, but they should take into account that the majority of the jurors believe something that's different from the conclusion they've reached, and consider whether they have to change their conclusion based not on the fact that the majority rules, but on the fact that the majority may have reasoning for their conviction that is persuasive.
All right, Jim Zirin, former Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. Thank you so much, as always, for joining us on Balance of Power. He, of course, joining us from our headquarters up in New York. And in New York City is where Donald Trump is again today, as we have this trial continuing to play out. And we know it will do so for at least the next week, as closing arguments are set for Tuesday. In the meantime, while Donald Trump was spending time in New York, he was traveling this weekend, including an appearance at the NRA, where he gave a speech in Dallas, Joe, over the weekend. We can get into that in a moment. While Joe Biden was doing some traveling of his own, including to Atlanta, where he gave the commencement address at Morehouse College. There were some silent protesters while he was speaking, and he referenced specifically the ongoing war in Gaza. Here he is.
It's a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. That's why I've called for an immediate ceasefire. An immediate ceasefire to stop the fighting. Bring the hostages home. And I've been working on a deal as we speak, working around the clock to lead an international effort to get more aid into Gaza, rebuild Gaza. I'm also working around the clock for more than just one ceasefire. I'm working to bring the region together, working to build a lasting, durable peace.
President Biden at Morehouse College over the weekend, an anticipated address. There were a lot of concerns about protesters in that speech. It largely did not materialize, though there were a handful, about a half dozen students, and I believe one educator who turned their backs to Joe Biden while he was speaking. One raised a fist, that was it. He did acknowledge them. during his speech and talked about the right of peaceful protest. Laura Davison is with us right now at the table, Bloomberg Politics editor, coming off of all of these speeches over the weekend. Laura, it's good to see you. Did Joe Biden get done what he was looking to get done here in terms of delivering a message? It wasn't just Morehouse last week. He had a series of events over the course of 4 days to address black voters in this country, which has been a real deficit for him for many issues, including his policy in Gaza.
He did. He got through all these events without any sort of major flub, as well as, without facing the protesters that were, considered to be a major threat to the speech, potentially very disruptive. Silent protesting in some ways is sort of a smart strategy because you get to remain in the room. If you become rambunctious, of course, security will escort you out. So this was both sides were able to sort of notch a win in this one. You'll note that Donald Trump is also taking note of Biden's outreach to black voters. He himself has an event planned in the South Bronx later this week, kind of billed as being, a way to reach out to minority voters and talk about how Joe Biden's policies have, in his words, failed black and Hispanic voters. So we're kind of seeing both sides play this out in their own way.
On the subject of Donald Trump, over the weekend, we heard him say a number of things in that speech in Dallas, but among them, suggestions that maybe he could be in not just for a second term, but a third. Laura, is that real? We've seen iterations of that kind of language from him before.
Yes, so this is the way that Trump sort of hints at ideas without totally crossing the line. So the way he kind of talked about this was well, if we won in 2020, technically I would be winning a third time, and so this would be my third term. But though obviously he hasn't been president for the past 3.5 years, and so this is him sort of flirting with different ideas, floating a trial balloon, and seeing what kind of reaction it gets. This is the same thing with the dictator for a day kind of comment. You saw a really strong reaction on that. So this is kind of what he's doing of playing around, being careless with language, and sort of seeing what the response is.
It's hard not to note that Donald Trump had some trouble on stage at both of his events this weekend in a way that would have probably been very big news if it had happened to Joe Biden. On Saturday night, he almost kind of stumbled off the podium, which was rickety to his credit. He called out the contractors in the room for it, and he froze in front of the NRA. It would appear to be freeze. At least he stopped talking for longer than 30 seconds at one point yesterday. Wouldn't that be a big story if it were Joe Biden? How come it's not for Donald Trump?
He has been able to evade the age issue in a way that Joe Biden, I'll include Mitch McConnell as well, has not been able to. He famously froze in several high-profile speeches and press conferences, and it's been a major issue, and kind of effectively ended his term as majority leader in the Senate, or a Republican leader in the Senate. So this is the thing, though, that if it keeps coming, it's going to be a problem for him, over the next several weeks and months.
All right, Laura Davison, Bloomberg Politics editor, thank you so much. I would note that when he did pause, there was music playing.
That's true.
So maybe it was partially for dramatic effect, but to your point, Joe, it lasted for a considerable amount of time.
Yeah, and it may be nothing, but I always find it interesting what people pay attention to. A lot more ahead on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.
Street, we do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We've got the S&P and NASDAQ both trading at records. Dow in the red, back below 40,000. Dow Industrials down 43 right now. That is a drop of 0.1%. S&P up 15, gain there of 0.3%. NASDAQ up 125 for NASDAQ, a gain of 0.75%. 10-year at 4.43% with a 2-year now yielding 4.83%. Spot gold up 0.6%, 24.30 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.7%, 79.46 a barrel. Jamie Dimon has long joked that his retirement is 5 years away, no matter when he's asked, but not today. During the firm's Investor Day, the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase told shareholders the timetable is, quote, not 5 years anymore. He also said the largest American bank is well on the way with its succession plans. Right now, J.P. Morgan Chase shares, they're down 2.6%. Recapping, stocks are mixed. S&P 500 index up 15, a gain of 0.3%. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington once again. Your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet with a look at the Monday trade. It's a new week for financial markets. It's a new week here in Washington as well, although it seems like, at least in the United States Senate, they're going to be dealing with an old issue. Because according to the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, who sent a Dear Colleague letter out yesterday, the Senate will return to the pressing issue of our nation's border security. He went on to say, Joe, the Senate is prepared to take up the Bipartisan Border Act as a standalone measure this coming week. For those who forgot, this was the deal negotiated between Republicans and Democrats in the Senate, and the White House never made it for a vote the first time around. Donald Trump maybe had a helping hand in killing that effort. But I guess if at first you don't succeed, Joe, try again?
Or message again, because no one sees this passing. And we're going to spend the next 10 minutes with our panel here looking at this same strategy being employed on both sides of the aisle. This is Washington. This is also partly why people hate Washington. So let's get into this right now. Kaylee, you're right. The border is coming to the floor this week in the Senate. And there are about 5 Democrats who this is happening for, as Chuck Schumer tries to get everybody on the record. So frontline Democrats, of course, running for re-election in difficult states, will be able to say, hey, I fought for securing the border. Jeannie Sheehan Zaino is with us, Bloomberg Politics contributor, of course, Democratic analyst. And I should note as well, now senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Congrats on that new addition to the business card, Jeannie. Chapin Fay, Republican strategist from Actum, is also with us here. So, Jeannie, why don't you get us started on what it is we're actually seeing? Because nobody expects that border bill to pass. What's Chuck Schumer trying to do?
Well, this is what we see in Washington during the summer of a really tough election year. And so Chuck Schumer is reading the same polls we are, and he knows that Democrats have a problem when it comes to immigration. He wants to mitigate that problem as much as possible. He wants to give his 5 really vulnerable senators, Rosen, Baldwin, Tester, the group, Casey, a vote that they can go back to their constituents and say, we voted for a tougher border bill. And of course, it doesn't hurt if he also is able to say that Democrats are not in this box that Republicans seem to think they are in immigration, that they have a plan and a policy to address it. But, Donald Trump, sunk that some time ago for political reasons. So it is a purely political vote. It has no hope of going forward. And of course, it's not just Republicans who will vote against it. It's Democrats, some progressives and some Hispanics like Padilla and Menendez. So it's going to be a show vote, if you will, of the best kind in an election year.
Well, for those Republicans who vote against it, Chapin, how problematic is this for them? Are voters not wise to the idea that they may have had a chance to vote for some stronger measures at the border and didn't?
Yeah, I think you always run that risk. But I think that if you look at the data and the polling and sort of in these areas, I don't think the Republicans are getting the blame for immigration. So I think the American voters know that this is a show vote. They know that it's a little cynical. And again, I'm not really disparaging Democrats for doing it. Republicans do it as well, but it is certainly cynical election year ploy. I think voters can see through that, right? And they know that a piece of legislation is not going to fix everything that's broken in our immigration system. So it may have somewhat of a small desired effect, but it's not going to, it's not really going to hurt the Republicans on immigration. I just don't see anything the left or Biden can do that would hurt or take the issue away unless Biden came out with some very forceful plan on closing the border even temporarily, or doing any of that kind of stuff. That might have an effect. That might, if a good test case is if you look at what Congressman Swazi said in his election, in the special election against Maisie Phillips recently. He took immigration away from her, but he's a moderate, almost a conservative on some issues, and he went all the way to the right on that issue. That was the way he took it away from her successfully. I don't see the Democrats doing that, so I don't think this vote is going to have as big a desired effect.
Well, like you just said, Chapin, this is a strategy employed by both sides. And I think this is indicative of where we are here in the congressional calendar and the election cycle. Pretty much everything from here on out is probably going to be a messaging bill. There's a new one on in vitro fertilization. Katie Britt and Ted Cruz, two Republican senators, of course, out with this bill to protect IVF following the Alabama state ruling that got this onto the front pages, the front burners and so forth. And we should note that the Alabama legislature has already acted. This is not a thing, but they're looking for a national answer to this with an op-ed on the Wall Street Journal this morning and a sit-down interview with Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern, who asked why this is needed. Here's Ted Cruz.
The Alabama Supreme Court decision came out. There was a lot of confusion, there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of misunderstanding, and people did not want anything to threaten IVF. I agree with that. Katie agrees with that. And so we came together and said, let's draft a simple, straightforward federal bill that creates a federal right, that you as a parent have a right to have access to IVF. If you want to have a child and you need medical assistance to do so, that should be your right. This is a bill, I think, that should be overwhelmingly bipartisan. The Senate should pass this bill 100-0. We'll see if they do or not, but on the merits, that's what should happen.
Jeannie, is this any different than what we're seeing Democrats do with the border? We're certainly tackling two of the most divisive issues in the 2024 campaign here.
Absolutely. I do see differences. The similarities are these are both election year bills, but the reality is Republicans are in this position. And we are in a position in our country where we are being told that women and their fetuses have the same rights under the Constitution because of the rights push on Roe and because of the overturning of Dobbs. It was a fringe legal theory. It has now burst up into a national discussion of which Republicans, to your point, are having a difficult time at the ballot box. And so they're trying to wiggle their way out of it. Of course, we saw in the bill, and Anne-Marie brought this up in her interview with Senator Tammy Duckworth's bill, and the response from Cindy Hyde-Smith when she blocks it was, while she wants women and men to be able to have access to IVF, she believes human right or human life should be protected. And that's the problem Republicans find themselves in. People like Cindy Hyde-Smith, and that's why she blocked that bill. We'll have to see what she does on this one.
Well, Chapin, if they're trying to get at protecting IVF, in vitro fertilization specifically, obviously that is a very narrow targeted bill in this wider question of reproductive rights, which seemingly is how increasingly President Biden is framing it. It's not just about the issue of production of abortion, but overall reproductive rights. Is one bill on IVF going to be able to fix the messaging problem for Republicans on the wider issue?
I don't think so. But I do think, I do see some differences. Yes, this is an election year bill. Yes, this is done because Republicans have an issue on this, but it is a substantive fix to one particular problem. And one of the problems that happens all the time, to go back to something earlier that I was asked about, whether these election year bills are going to have any effect. One of the problems is they get loaded up and it's not as clean cut. And we've been through this rodeo before. So the American people know that when an abortion bill is coming to, if Ted Cruz is going to get his abortion bill considered, it's going to go way farther once everyone else has their say in it. Same thing with the immigration bills that have been raised and voted upon. Like, there's some fixes, but then they get laden down. Sometimes it's pork, sometimes it's other things, and there's overreach. It seems that neither party can just do a simple bill and you can introduce it and get it passed, right? It always comes out looking crazy. And that's, why nothing ever gets done. So I do think there's all those issues that go into it. Though I would just say on the Republican bill, it's one of those things, do we want to protect the right to IVF? I mean, yes or no, it's pretty simple. We could just do a clean bill on that, or we could complicate it and have it go nowhere. I think we know where it's going to go.
I guess it is indicative, as we mentioned in the outset, though, of the congressional agenda here. Jeannie, is there anything worth paying attention to between now and November?
Oh, of course, a lot to pay attention to, but probably not much action on the floor in Congress beyond these types of messaging bills. I think the big question in my mind is about funding for next year, but I don't think we're going to get very far, at least this summer, on that. But, my hope and prayer would be that they could do it a lot quicker than they did last year, but don't hold me to that.
All right, we won't. Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributor and senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Thank you for joining us alongside Chapin Fay today. He is Republican strategist and managing director at Actum. And to your point, Joe, and we're probably going to talk about this with the House Majority Whip, Tom Emmer, the congressman from Minnesota, later on at 5 p.m. on Balance of Power. All the big work's done.
That's correct.
It's just a matter of maybe some messaging bills or some other things on the side, including potentially crypto legislation that's going to get a vote.
Is this crypto week? Can we say that out
loud?
They're
kind of calling it crypto week.
In a former life, you would have been running around. You'd be stationed on Capitol Hill. But look, we're lucky to have a crypto expert with us. If you're watching us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube, I'm pointing to Kaylee Lines because we are going to talk a lot more about that. 2 big crypto bills actually in the hopper for this week, right?
Yeah, so a lot more is still ahead on that. First, though, let's get a check on world and national news with our expert on that, Amy Morris, in our 99.1 newsroom here in Washington. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Kaylee. Donald Trump's hush money trial is on a lunch break now. Michael Cohen is expected to return to the witness stand for redirect. Prosecutors want to introduce a photo of Trump and his bodyguard during a key phone call from Cohen. We expect to get that answer when court resumes in about 45 minutes. Now, this morning, the judge told the jury that closing arguments might not begin until a week from tomorrow. Last week, the judge had said that jurors should prepare to deliberate as early as this week. The Supreme Court has turned away a challenge to one assault weapons ban and has taken no action on another. The justice is rejecting a case involving Maryland's ban on semi-automatic assault-style rifles. It's been pending in federal appeals court for more than a year. At the same time, the justices took no action on a similar law in Illinois, leaving open the possibility of a Supreme Court case on the Second Amendment coming up. The chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court says he's seeking arrest warrants for Israeli and Hamas leaders, including Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The White House calls that outrageous. Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan has charged both leaders with crimes against humanity. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Amy Morris, and this is Bloomberg.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Lows of the day right now on the Dow Jones Industrial Average, down 100 points, 39,902 on the Dow. A drop right now of 0.2%. We got the S&P pushing higher, trading at a record, up another 9, up 0.2%. NASDAQ up 99, gain there of 0.6%. 10-year 4.43%, with a 2-year right now that's yielding 4.83%. Spot gold up 0.8%. 24.35, and West Texas Intermediate crude down 1%, 79.26 for a barrel of WTI. Cruise stocks pushing higher. Norwegian Cruise Line Holdings is raising its full-year profit outlook for the second time this month, while also updating its midterm strategic vision. Right now, Norwegian up 7.8%, Royal Caribbean up 4.8%, Carnival Corp up by 6.8%. Recapping, we're looking at a mixed Monday here. Dow Industrials down 102 right now. S&P up 9, a gain there of 0.2%. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington once again. Your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
Okay, Charlie, thank you. Charlie Pellet in New York on what's going to be a memorable earnings reporting week, if only because of NVIDIA. That's, I believe, Wednesday evening. Kaylee will be talking a lot more about that. It's interesting. Sometimes these earnings reports and what we learn on the conference calls collide with policy we're talking about here in Washington, and this might be one of them. As we turn our attention to a whole different policy, and that is foreign policy, the operation that's happening in the waters off of Gaza, this temporary pier that the United States has built at great cost to try to get humanitarian aid into Gaza and around some of the choke points that we've seen on land. There are still a lot of questions, Kaylee, about whether this is working, but there's actually some great reporting in the New York Times today, now that it has been put in place. Aid starts entering Gaza through U.S.-built pier, but officials say it is not enough. And based on our prior conversations with Cindy McCain at the World Food Program, we have a long way to go.
Because we're talking here about hundreds of thousands of people essentially on the brink of famine. Can you get enough aid in to match the scale of the need is really the question. And sure, this floating pier may go some way into trying to bridge that gap, but can it go all the way? The answer is probably not, but let's get an expert's perspective on this now. I'm pleased to say joining us here on Balance of Power, Dave Hardin, the managing director at Georgetown Strategy Group. He is also former USAID mission director to the West Bank and Gaza and served as a senior advisor to President Barack Obama's special envoy for Middle East peace. Dave, thank you so much for coming here to Bloomberg Television and Radio. Just how far in your mind does this pier get us toward the goal of being able to provide food aid at scale for those in Gaza? Surely it makes a difference, but just how consequential of one?
It's not enough, and I think you laid it out. So Cindy McCain, the Republican, the wife of John McCain, a strong supporter of Israel historically, the head of the World Food Program, said that Gaza is facing famine, and that famine is creeping south. On the Biden administration side, Samantha Power has also said the same. So what needs to happen is every crossing all the time without limit. And that includes Rafah and Kerem Shalom, Erez, Route 96, and more, plus the pier. We need it all. And by the way, the more access points you have, the least valuable any one particular access point is. And so that reduces risk and chance of attack.
I appreciate the comprehensive nature of your answer there, Dave, but specifically with the pier, this was just anchored in place on Friday.
Right.
And an important step here to completing this maritime corridor. How much time will you give this before you actually judge whether this is a successful operation?
I mean, I think we need to measure it now because famine is now. But in addition, any food coming in is an addition. It's an additive component, and it's coming into the middle. The other reason why I actually like this is because it sets a precedent, facts on the ground, so to speak, in favor of the Palestinians, where food and commodity and basic imports can come in through a maritime route. But again, the proof ultimately will be the results as it relates to famine and violence. And this pier will not solve the fundamentals.
Well, to that exact point on the fundamentals, Dave, you say famine is now. Is there any way to bring that famine to an end without a temporary ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas? Because increasingly, it looks like that is farther out of reach.
Possibly. Let me just note that in the Israeli cities of Ashkelon and Ashdod, which are very close to Gaza, there is no famine, right? And so famine is hyper-localized into this conflict zone. It's manufactured. Therefore, it can be unmanufactured. I actually have been arguing that the private sector needs to be able to import, as they did prior to October 7th, the Gazan private sector, the Palestinian private sector. They were able to solve the last mile. The UN agencies and the donor community were never designed to provide all food for all people indefinitely. So I do think you need a ceasefire for sure, but you need a more comprehensive system and marketplace that allows more food to just go in, and it kind of reduces the price and the cost. You need to flood the market, so to speak.
Spending time with Dave Harden from the Georgetown Strategy Group. I want to get back, Dave, to the original premise here, because it really is incredible what we're seeing. The U.S. going to such lengths involving our military in a very expensive operation to put this temporary pier in place, knowing, of course, that our ally may be part of the problem, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have had to go to this extreme. The gates would be opening for our trucks. We may not have had to resort to an airdrop either. So I guess I wonder at this point, when you see the trucks coming in, or even those that aren't allowed to come in, is Israel still a threat to humanitarian aid, or is it about getting past Hamas?
I mean, I think it's both, but the primary responsibility rests with Israel. Israel is the occupying authority over Gaza, and so therefore the responsibility to mitigate famine rests with them, and that requires all access from all points all the time. And again, it's just simply the case that we have to flood the marketplace. But let me just point out an obvious but cognitive dissonance. The U.S. is funding the bombs, the attacks by Israel, the food, the pier, all sides of this chaotic situation. And I do think that the gap between Netanyahu and Biden is deepening. And I like the fact that Gallant has kind of thrown, that's the defense minister, and in the war cabinet on Israel's side, threw down a gauntlet to Netanyahu saying that there had to be a day after plan. Without a day after plan, Hamas stays in power, the conflict continues, and the famine will not be resolved. And at the end of this, we have 2.2 million people that are not only in famine, but bearing grievances that will last generations. And by the way, malnutrition that will last a lifetime.
Dave, we got news today from a prosecutor from the International Criminal Court who has applied for arrest warrants to not just officials from Hamas, but including Israeli officials. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is one of them. And in this request, in the statement, in part, it reads, on the basis of evidence collected and examined by my office, I have reasonable grounds to believe that Benjamin Netanyahu goes on to say, has responsibility for the following war crimes. The first one listed, Dave, is starvation of civilians as a method of warfare as a war crime contrary to the statute. Is that a valid assessment in your mind?
I mean, the International Criminal Court is not going to be the solution here, and it's not going to bring about a resolution more quickly. I agree with the Biden administration on this, but the burden of mitigating famine, which is slightly different than what the ICC is saying, 100% rests with Israel as the occupying authority. There's just no way beyond that. Whether or not, at the end of the day, they're culpable as a legal matter in an international court that probably doesn't have jurisdiction and isn't widely recognized except in a host of other countries, but certainly not in Israel and the United States. I don't know if that matters. What matters, I think, will be a diplomatic solution where Netanyahu sees a path forward that includes a governing Palestinian Authority in Gaza, a ceasefire, a return of the hostages, and really very quickly an end to the famine. So the ICC is not really the analysis. It could be right. It might not be right. It's not really the analysis that I think is helpful in kind of unwinding and blunting this famine.
He's former USAID mission director to the West Bank and Gaza, so he knows what he speaks. Dave Harden, it's great to have you back, Dave, now managing director at Georgetown Strategy Group, and always a fascinating conversation, Kaylee, as we just try to get a sense of what's going on the ground. It's not always that simple. Here in Washington, we're hearing new calls now, additional calls for the resignation of the head of the FDIC. This is something we spent time on last week. Kaylee, of course, the chair, Grunberg, was up there for 2 brutal days of testimony. House and Senate last week. He was grilled by lawmakers. Many of them asked for his resignation. Some even went further to call for the stripping of his pension. But now the chairman is speaking, Sherrod Brown, along with others.
The Democrat of the Senate Banking Committee, the chair, Sherrod Brown, today saying in a statement, there must be fundamental changes at the FDIC. Those changes begin with new leadership. That's why I'm calling on the president to immediately nominate a new chair who can lead the FDIC at this challenging time. Again, this is a Democrat, a very powerful one
today too,
in terms of financial regulators' oversight, who is saying this.
Is seen as potentially the death knell when it comes to his tenure, right? Ben Bain knows more than we do about it. He covers this for a living here at Bloomberg in Washington. Is with us now at the table. Are we done here? Need a new leader at the FDIC?
Well, Sherrod Brown coming out today and calling around the White House to replace him is certainly a significant development. I think some people thought if he was able to make it through these, as you said, 2 brutal hearings last week, maybe we would get a better sense if he was able to kind of stick around for a while, maybe make it over that really tough hump. Today, this injects a new sense of urgency. Last week, we saw Maxine Waters, who chairs the House Financial Services, who's the top Democrat in the House Financial Services Committee, come out and actually defend him. Elizabeth Warren also said that he should stay. So there was kind of a feeling the Democrats were going to kind of rally here, and the White House has avoided saying that he should indeed step down or be replaced. But yeah, this is a pretty significant development today, politically.
And it's not just Sherrod Brown who has come out today. Sheila Bair, a former FDIC chair herself, posted on X, I have known and worked with the chair for years, but goes on to say this controversy is hurting him and his agency for his own sake and everyone at the FDIC. He should announce his intention to resign effective with the appointment. The problem is, Ben, if Marty Grunberg goes out, who steps in? Who can do so in time to still try to wrap up the job on this administration's financial regulatory agenda?
That's a very big question. There is this kind of broader political context here that we really can't divorce from all this. The FDIC, the Fed, and the Office of the Comptroller of Currency have proposed this big sweeping plan to increase capital requirements on Wall Street banks. And Marty Grunberg is seen as a very important piece of getting that done. And any hope of getting that done before November certainly gets very complicated should he leave, resign, be replaced, whatever it might be, because then you would have 2-2 at this agency on the board. Right. 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and Republicans have not shown a lot of love for this proposal, if you will, to put it mildly.
Well, and at the moment when we're seeing some of the more ambitious approaches to that be scaled back.
Right. So, this just adds a whole new sense of kind of complexity to this plan. I mean, and that plan really is kind of the cornerstone banking regulation plan during the Biden administration, obviously coming off of last year's regional banking crisis. This was really seen as a really big thing that these regulators were going to get done. Now, without Martin Grunberg, if he were to step down, if he were to be replaced or whatever it might be, that gets a lot more complicated.
So just to be clear, if someone were to be put into an acting role, they can't cast a vote on that? So, theoretically, it has to be a confirmed chair?
So my understanding is that it would be 2-2, and then it would really be on the Biden administration to quickly nominate and confirm someone to actually change the balance there.
Well, that's awfully important. I mean, there has been reporting this morning that Jamie Dimon is kind of getting what he wants here in this case, or something closer to what he wants. How would you frame
So certainly the banks and bank lobby pushed back vigorously against this capital plan.
They spent millions.
And we saw ads on NFL games. Yeah. Right. We saw CEOs testifying in Congress. We even saw small business owners fanning out across Capitol Hill talking about how this would potentially, as they would say, impact their businesses. So anything that slows that down or anything that changes that plan is certainly a win for the big banks because they have fought vigorously to keep this from really taking hold as it was proposed. Now, it could still change. It could still be altered as it typically would be. And to understand, both the Fed Vice Chair for Supervision, Michael Barr, and Fed Chair Jay Powell have both said to expect broad and material changes to that plan. So we do expect some changes. How far they'll go is the ultimate question.
All right, Ben Bain is always looking for the answer to that question, along with his team here at Bloomberg, who covers financial regulation for us. Thank you so much. So this really is the question, Joe. What is the end game of the Basel III end game? And if Marty Gruenberg does indeed resign, is that
Wouldn't
game
that
over?
be a wrinkle in this after all the months that has gone into this, all the effort? It would be quite remarkable. Great to have Ben Bain with us back at the table as we prepare to send things to New York. Carol Master, Tim Stenovic, coming up next on Bloomberg Business Week. Haley, I'll meet you for the late edition of Balance of Power at 5.
Yeah, we're going to have a great show, including the House Majority Whip, Tom Emmer, who will be joining us. So make sure to tune in at 5 p.m. right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody, live on radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals. This is Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Masser along with Tim Stenivek. And this setup on this Monday, May 20th, looks like, Tim, we could get another record on the S&P 500.
Count it. Could be the 24th record if we do close in the green today. Thanks in part to NVIDIA rallying on a bullish analyst call just days ahead of that quarterly, the last of the so-called Magnificent Seven companies to report.
Yeah, right. Kind of wrapping up this earnings season, but that's a big one. Plus, in a week where we also get FOMC minutes, in just a minute, we are going to hear from Cleveland Fed President Loretta Mester sitting down with her own Michael McKee. Looking forward to that. And then we've got a really incredible lineup.
Yeah, we do. NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang, along with Dell Chair CEO and founder Michael Dell, and ServiceNow CEO Bill McDermott. They are going to be joining us, joining Ed Ludlow in just a minute.
And then our one more thing, another day, another stock soaring thanks to GLP-1s. It seems like similar, but we're going to get into that story.
Compounding pharmacies.
Yeah, exactly. FDA, though, oversight?
Okay.
All right. We're going to talk about that. Hey, folks, a slew of Fed speakers today. San Francisco Fed President Mary Daly, Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic, Fed Vice Chair Philip Jefferson. They've all been out, some of them, Tim, in Amelia Island.
Yeah, that's where the Atlanta Fed hosts its annual financial markets conference. As Bloomberg's Steve Matthews reminds us, it's often regarded, Carol, as the second most prominent Fed conference after that August gathering out in Jackson Hole.
And at the gathering in Amelia Island, Bloomberg News international economics and policy correspondent, our own Michael McKee, sitting down with Cleveland Fed President Loretta Mester. Mike, over to you.
Well, hi, guys, and hello to everybody watching and listening around the world on Bloomberg Radio and television. I have to say, it's tough to get people to come to a resort area like this. We've got about half the Federal Reserve here, I think, including Loretta Mester. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
They were just talking, Carol and Tim, we're just talking about how we might see another record in the markets today. And I'm wondering how you look at that, because everybody says the Fed has let financial conditions get too loose, and that is going to lead to inflation again. But financial conditions indexes really measure asset prices. And if asset prices go up, then financial conditions get looser. It's sort of circular. Do you think that you're restrictive at this point?
Oh, I think monetary policy is restrictive. We're in restrictive territory. But no doubt the economy has performed stronger in the first 3 months of the year than we probably had anticipated, than I had anticipated. At the same time, we saw that inflation progress stalled in the first 3 months. We did get a April CPI report, which was welcome news, but I think it's too soon to tell what path inflation's on, so we just need to collect more information on that. But we're seeing moderation on some of the real side of the economy. It's still a strong economy, but we are seeing the impact of the monetary policy that we put in place.
Well, do you reject the idea that financial conditions got loose and that's the reason the first 4 months of the year we saw inflation level out or go up a little bit?
Yeah, the markets are going to be the markets, right? They move up and down. I think the way I look at it is, we have a restrictive monetary policy in place. It has shown up in terms of moderating the labor markets. They're becoming better balanced between labor demand and labor supply, and so we're seeing that kind of work its way through. And that rebalancing is going to put downward pressure on inflation, I think, as things play out. It's just that we didn't see that in the first 3 months of the year, and we're just going to need to gather more evidence on what exact path inflation's on in order to sort of determine whether it's on that sustainable downward path of 2% that we're all looking for.
There's been some thought that because of the nature of changes in the economy, part of the Fed's problem is that monetary policy doesn't reach a lot of the areas that have been showing price increases. Do you think you have a broad enough anchor on the economy to bring it all down, or are there still going to be hot spots you have to deal with?
Well, I think a lot of things happened during the pandemic, and we're still seeing sort of those pandemic effects. I don't think we can conclude that monetary policy isn't having an effect as it used to, but the transmission mechanism is something that changes over time, and we'll have to monitor that in order to sort of calibrate policy to where the economy is and where it's going. balancing those risks to both sides of our mandate. And that's what we're in the process of doing now. We gather information, right? We look to see where the economy is at the moment, where it's headed, and then we calibrate our policy in order to reach both parts of our dual mandate. And really, frankly, in the first part of the year, what we saw was the risks that we were too restrictive have gone down. You know, last year people were worried about, oh, the Fed may be getting too restrictive and therefore it's going to dampen the economy. Those risks went down. At the same time, the risks to inflation, I think, are tilted to the upside and remain so. And so that's the balancing that we have to do as we set policy going forward.
Well, you and most of your colleagues have basically said we don't have to do anything right now. We can afford to sit and watch because the economy is in pretty good shape. So the markets are fascinated with when you will have your first rate cut. Are you?
Yeah. Well, I don't think about it in terms of when, right? It really is dependent on how the economy is faring and where it's going and in the progress on our dual mandate goals. So what we're going to be doing is looking at that progress. The first 3 months of the year, we didn't see progress. The CPI report, welcome numbers, but still elevated, too high inflation. And in fact, the monthly reading in April was higher than what we saw last year. Now, I wasn't one of the people who thought that we would continue to see the great progress we saw in the second half of the year continue this year. I always thought we'd see some slowing progress, partly because I think we got a lot of help from the supply side last year. And as supply chains have become more normal, and as labor markets have become in better balance, I wouldn't have expected to see as much progress. Nonetheless, the lack of progress, I think, is something that certainly I didn't find welcome at all. And so that's why we have to continue to gather data and really see it. But as you say, there's no real risk in doing that at the moment because the real side of the economy, growth, labor markets are in good shape.
Well, there's old sort of saw that recessions don't happen slowly. They come on rather immediately. And there are people on Wall Street who are worried that the Fed will be behind the curve on growth. Do you have any concerns that there may be something happening that you're not able to measure correctly?
Well, you know, we look at data for sure, we have models for sure, but we do a lot of speaking to businesses. We gather a lot of information from contacts all across my district is the fourth district, but every president of the Federal Reserve is doing the same thing. And so that's very good information because it's more forward-looking than the data. And a lot of the people that we talked to in the first quarter of the year were actually telling us that, wow, things are stronger than even we anticipated that they would be. So it wasn't just the data showing strong, it was they were also saying. Nonetheless, they did say that they're being more cautious, you know, and more careful. Some projects have been put on hold because they want to sort of see how the economy fares. And that's kind of the mechanism that monetary policy is having. It is starting to moderate demand. It just hasn't moderated as fast as some of us might have expected it to this year. In fact, the last time we put in forecast, you know, I had upped my forecast for growth this year to be above trend as opposed to below trend. So I think we're all sort of looking at the data. Businesses are doing so, we're doing so, and we're trying to calibrate to where the economy is and where it's going.
Well, speaking of forecasts, you get to put in one more before your retirement at the end of June. What's your outlook for inflation the rest of the year?
Yeah, well, you know, we're going to gather all the data that we're going to put together, and I'm going to put my forecasts in there. I still think, broadly speaking, that inflation is going to come down. That's my modal forecast, that we'll see inflation come down. I just don't think it's going to come down quickly. And so that's why it's really going to be this risk management kind of proposition, as the Fed always has to do, is sort of managing the risks around both of our dual mandate goals. If you remember back to the beginning when we started raising rates, monetary policy was not well positioned for the high inflation readings we were getting, and so we had to increase rates at a very quick pace and to a high level. You know, right now, I think monetary policy is well positioned for risk on either side. And so that's kind of, I think, what we're going to be doing going forward is making sure that we're well calibrated for whatever risks end up happening. And so we're well calibrated now. If there is some deterioration on the real side of the economy that we aren't foreseeing, as you said, you know, we're well positioned to address that by lowering rates. If it turns out that inflation is stalling out, not my base case, or even going up, not my base case, we're well positioned to deal with that too, either by holding rates at current levels for longer, or if appropriate, raising the rate. That, again, that's not my base case. My base case is that inflation is going to start moving back down on a slow, gradual path back to 2%. But we'll have to see, and that's what we're going to be doing, is gathering information.
What odds would you put on the idea of inflation accelerating again, forcing you to maybe raise rates?
Well, I think there are upside risks. My base case is that inflation will gradually move back down, but I think we have to be open to the fact that, you know, the economy can surprise you. We've seen that during this episode of high inflation, partly, I think, because the pandemic was a significant event, and then the reaction to it was significant, and the economy may be changing. And so we have to be open to the possibility and be prepared for it. But that, again, my modal forecast is that we'll see inflation move down. But that's why we're going to be having to be very, you know, careful in monitoring what's actually happening in the economy.
When you do start cutting rates, how far do you think the Fed will go? What would be maybe the kind of neutral rate that Americans should expect?
Right. So I do think that there are reasons to believe that the neutral rate is higher than it used to be. And in fact, as you mentioned, we put in these forecasts 4 times a year, and the last one I actually raised my view of the long-run neutral rate. But, you know, we're going to be setting policy again to achieve our dual mandate goals. And so that's kind of what guides our everyday policy decisions over the coming months and over the next year or so. And that's where we're kind of getting to. The reason I thought that it was likely that the real rate would have to be higher than it was pre-pandemic is because there are reasons to think that investment will be higher. It's this balance between investments and savings that kind of drive where that neutral rate is. And there are reasons to think that investment's higher, that productivity growth may end up being higher than it's been pre-pandemic. We've seen a lot of automation going into firms that had to deal with labor shortages, and that automation will pay off in terms of higher productivity growth. So again, you know, not saying necessarily that we know where the neutral rate is, because we know that that can be estimated with a great uncertainty, but I do think there's reason to think that it may be higher now than it was in the past.
Only got about 30 seconds left, but one last question. This is going to be your last time to vote on policy, right, and to put out a dot plot. Where's your dot going to be? How many moves?
Well, I haven't determined that yet. You know, I was on the record before saying I was at the median, which was 3. The developments I've seen in the economy right now, I would not think that that's still appropriate because the inflation risks have moved up given the progress on inflation. It stalled out in the first quarter. And frankly, the real side is a little bit stronger than I anticipated. So, but again, we're going to be guided by progress on those dual mandate goals. And we need to be more confident that inflation is on that sustainable downward path of 2% before we cut.
All right, I'll take that as somewhere between 0 and 3, probably not 3. Loretta Mester, thank you very much for joining us today here at Amelia Island. We'll send it back to you, Carol and Tim.
All right, Mike, great stuff. Our Michael McKee there in Amelia Island there with Cleveland Fed President Loretta Mester, and some really interesting headlines coming out of it. And I think some of it is, you know, when she said specifically about reasons to believe neutral rate higher than it used to be. And this is something we talk about a lot. Maybe it's not 2%. Maybe it's something more significant.
Lots of other headlines, too. There are reasons to think that investment will be higher, reasons to believe, as you said, the neutral rate is higher than it used to be. She also said that the Fed can raise rates if appropriate, but that's not the base case. And right now, monetary policy is well positioned.
Yeah, exactly. And she says she thinks monetary policy is restrictive at this point. And so this is something, you know, we've talked with certainly a lot of guests about the lag effect of what we've seen in terms of a very aggressive Fed raising rates and then waiting for it to fully impact the economy. Some would say you're starting to see slowdowns in the labor market, but looking for some more significant moves to the downside of things slowing down.
She did say that she still thinks inflation is going to come down, but she just doesn't think inflation will come down quickly. Business contacts say that they are, though, being more cautious.
Well, we'll see what a couple of business contacts have to say right now. We're going to head over to the Dell Technology World event in Las Vegas. That's where we find Bloomberg Technology's Ed Ludlow sitting down with Dell Chairman, Founder, and CEO Michael Dell, the NVIDIA co-founder, President and CEO Jensen Huang, and ServiceNow Chairman and CEO Bill McDermott. Ed, all yours.
Yeah, thank you, Carol. I would call it all arms of the AI supply chain or market gathered here, and the 3 CEOs just on stage together moments ago. Our host is Michael Dell, CEO and chairman of Dell, and a company celebrating 40 years as well at this event. NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang, it's good to see you, and Bill McDermott, chairman and CEO of ServiceNow. I think it's probably sensible to ask, is this the first time that the three of you have actually been in the same room at the same time? And Michael, to you as our host, why the three of you in the same room at the same time?
Well, you know, at Dell Technologies World, we love to bring our customers and partners together and talk about what's new and what's exciting. And, you know, this AI opportunity is really tremendous. And we can never do anything by ourselves, but this is a great example of how you have an ecosystem of companies coming together along with all these incredible innovations in GPUs and compute, and storage and networking, and all the AI models and software companies that are utilizing all this power. And it's causing a new industrial revolution.
There are 5 things that I would like to talk about. The first being the relationship between the three of you and your companies, how you work together. The second being AI infrastructure, how durable what's happening is. AI PC. You know, you've been talking about AI PC on social media for some time, and officially, of course, as well. US leadership. You know, I reflect that I have 3 American CEOs sat around me, all pulling towards the same sort of goal. And finally, increasingly, people ask me to ask you about power and energy consumption, and whether we should start talking about that. But really, Jensen, the origin of this, and one of the reasons I wanted to have the conversation was GTC. I'm paraphrasing, but you said basically there is no one better at end-to-end systems at scale than Dell. You basically said if you want a server, you phone Michael Dell. But why? Specifically, how is it that NVIDIA interacts with that part of Michael's business?
Well, this is a really important time where we've re-engineered and reinvented every layer of computing, from the chip to the operating system to the system servers to the way that these data centers are put together. There's only one company in the world that can have the ability to build the computing system, the storage system, the networking system, all of the software that goes along with it, and the path to the world's enterprise. You know, we want to bring this generative AI capability to every company in the world. And some of them can use it in the cloud, but many of the applications still has to be done on-prem. And so in order for us to bring them into the generative AI revolution, we're going to have to go through a partner that can help us take this completely new reinvention of a computer, the data center, these AI factories, and help every customer have a, you know,
just really quickly, Jensen.
Yeah.
On-prem is back. Just really quick. Yes or no?
Oh, on-prem never left.
Okay.
But on-prem never left. But on-prem is you know, on-prem is cool again.
On-prem is cool again. Save that thought. Bill, you've been a software CEO for quite a long time. Yeah. You know, I knew you at SAP, now at ServiceNow. Have you ever had to have such a focus on the minutiae of a semiconductor company, a server company? Have you ever had to worry as much about the OEM and the chip maker that underpin what you're trying to do?
Well, I think Michael Dell and Jensen Huang are at the epicenter of the AI revolution. This is enabling ServiceNow to be what I dreamt it would be, the defining enterprise software company of the 21st century. We run our whole cloud on Dell Technologies. And that's a big deal because we're talking about 4 billion workflows and 4 trillion digital transactions on that platform, running 1 million business processes around the world. With Jensen, we were the first enterprise company to recognize the greatness of NVIDIA, and we began building large language models with Jensen 5 years ago. We have completely standardized on NVIDIA in our company, the whole stack, and we're taking that to market with both of these men for a couple of reasons. One, they're great human beings and great leaders, and it's an honor to be here with them today and to team up with them. And two, we keep our promises. And I think customers today, when they're betting
you were doing business with them when, frankly, all of this wasn't sexy.
Totally.
And now it is.
Totally. Actually, that's 100% true. And we'll always be doing business with them because trust is the ultimate human currency, and we trust them with our lives. So that's how it rolls.
This is all very nice, and I'm very grateful and honored almost to be here with the three of you. There's a contradiction, though, that that markets are often built on choice. Choice fosters competition. Competition is the mother of innovation, so the saying goes. I had the CoreWeave CEO on my show on Friday, and he was brutally honest about it. They look at other silicon, they benchmark, they look at how it might work within their system, but the reality that he painted to me, Michael, is that their clients and customers demand NVIDIA, so they give them NVIDIA. Would you say that Dell is in the same situation?
Yeah, and we do work a lot with CoreWeave, so we know about their use case. And look, I think the reason that Bill has partnered closely with NVIDIA and really NVIDIA is in a leadership position is because they've out-engineered other folks, and they've built a set of capabilities, including software, over many decades that has prepared for this opportunity. But you talked about on-prem. The other aspect of this is the edge, right? The physical world, the PC, the factory floor, all the retail stores. AI is going to be everywhere, and having that sort of entire ecosystem of capabilities, that's ultimately what's going to drive success. But if it isn't in a great position, Jensen's done a fabulous job bringing the world the most innovative accelerated computing solutions.
Could you define for us AI factory? What is an AI factory?
Sure. So an AI factory is really a supply chain that creates intelligence. So if you think about a traditional factory, right, you've got all these ingredients, and we know a lot about supply chains. It's kind of what we do. But think about it as a supply chain to create intelligence inside your company. And to do that, it all starts with data, right? If you have no data, you have no AI, right? If you have bad data, you have bad AI. So you got to organize your data. It's something we know a lot about because data equals storage, and we store more data than anybody in the world. So you start with the data, and then you get into the ecosystem of all the software and the models that you're hearing about, the small and large models, the retrieval augmented generation. Of course, it's not just GPUs, it's also the networking and the storage and the memory that come together.
Well, I don't know if Jensen knows this, but you talk a lot about H100 is not just a chip you hold in your hand. In reality, it's DGX, right? HGX. Your staff are probably very nervous over your shoulder, but they've let me play with, let's say DGX, do a deadlift with it to illustrate the point.
It's 80 pounds, 35,000
80
parts.
pounds, thank you. But that's the scale of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Still, the AI market that I see is you selling H100 in DGX form to the hyperscalers. And I'm not yet seeing the AI factory that's going to the SME or the enterprise customer. When does that really happen, Jensen?
That's why today's announcement is such a big deal.
It unlocks
I'm here to announce this Dell AI factory with NVIDIA going to market starting today. In order to do this, just think about what an AI factory is. It has CPUs and GPUs. It has networking, switches, incredible amounts of software in systems connected to storage, and the miles of cables alone necessary to build up one of these things. Well, Michael turned it into an easy bit. And so that just as Dell did early days with PCs, they're now doing this with AI factories, so that any company can come to Dell and with a specification or the requirement, they could get into the business of producing. And this is the big idea, producing intelligence at scale.
So Bill is a buyer.
It's actually already happening. And companies like ServiceNow had the engineering resources to sort of build their own with our help and capability. But now we're already doing this with hundreds of enterprise companies. And there's also some services that go into this because it's a new thing, it's a new architecture. And you saw us announce new capabilities today around storage and networking. Again, it's this whole solution, and we've created the easy button so that enterprises can kind of quickly implement and deploy these tools.
You could think about it through the lens of your customers that are themselves enterprise companies, probably of smaller size. Do you think that they are ready for this AI factory investment that they're going to have to make, essentially.
I know they are.
Okay.
You know, last week, for example, I had the pleasure of being with Microsoft and Satya, and what they're doing on Copilot, as an example, is something that every CEO is well aware of. What they're
big and small,
and we build our own domain-specific models on the ServiceNow platform. Why does that matter? Because we're really focused on experiences. There's an $11 trillion market in terms of GDP impact over the next 3 years, according to IDC. That is how we're going to help the world economy improve. Companies like Dell Technologies and NVIDIA and ServiceNow.
Yes.
But I also acknowledge your point. We have to be open. And for example, we have a great partnership with Microsoft. They're not in the room right now, but they're a great partner. You talk about them when they're not in the room, because that's very important to our customers, to have the Copilot and to have the Now Assist. We're reinventing industries with Jensen. Telecommunications was our first. You think about the networking path of a telco company. Think about service management. Think about Dell now with Now Assist and what we can do to combine that with Michael's incredible technologies. Every company in the world and every workflow for every company in every industry will be re-engineered in 24 months. This is a tsunami, Ed. This is a tsunami of change. And only the smart ones are going to recognize I have to plant the flag now. Whether the story is complete or not is not the issue. The train has moved out. It's on the fly.
So you made this analogy. I think you were channeling Jensen, but the idea is that when you stand at the platform, the train goes by fast. If you're on the train, it doesn't feel fast. I want to extrapolate out. There's something that Michael Dell's very good at, if you don't mind me saying, Michael, which is selling to businesses, the public sector, probably in places, Jensen, that you don't have experience in, probably, given that the mainstay of your business is the hyperscalers. Do you believe that Michael Dell will convince those businesses to get on the train?
No question about it.
And do you need him to?
Absolutely. We've been partnering with Michael for coming up on 3 decades to reach the world's markets. In the old days, one of the first things that we worked on was PCs for gamers, and then PCs for industrial designers and car designers and so on and so forth. We're able to reach the world's enterprise through our partnership with Michael and partnership with Dell. And the thing that's really, really extraordinary this time is that it's not about just delivering a box, it's about delivering an entire infrastructure. And that entire infrastructure is insanely complex. The last 30 years, both of our companies have changed a lot. And he said it early, that everything that we've done has been the perfect preparation for today. If you want somebody to help you build an entire AI infrastructure, call Dell. And they'll come in. Not only do they have all the solutions and all the technologies, but they'll also have the professional services to help you stand it up and put it to work. And so we're working with Michael and Dell across everything, from CPUs to GPUs to networking to software, across the entire stack. Now, one of the things that it's so fun listening to Bill. I just sit here and just lay back. But you know, they were early in recognizing the enormous transformative capability of generative AI. ServiceNow used to be a platform of tools. Now they're going to be a platform of tools and agents that help you use those tools. They're sitting on a gold mine of opportunities so that we could have not just the tools to use to run our companies. We're going to have an AI operating system to run all of our companies with all the agents necessary to help us do that.
The next level down is the AI PC. It is here, according to today's announcement.
Yes.
I don't really even know where to start. You know, is the AI PC for the knowledge worker, or is it for every human around the world in the first instance?
You know, every time you have a new wave of technology, you've got kind of the early adopters, and at some point, you know, you inflect where there are mainstream use cases. And what's really going on right now inside companies is you had this incredible surge in buying PCs about 4 years ago with the pandemic.
That was COVID related,
right.
Yes.
And there was an enormous, you know, we have the biggest installed base ever. And so now these organizations are getting ready to replace those older machines. And they're thinking, wow, this AI thing, maybe there's something to it, right?
That could be daunting, though. If you take Bill's position, for example, he's made all the infrastructure investment and probably software and talent investment, and now he's thinking, okay, I've got to deck out my 24,000 staff around the world with AI PCs. Is that fair?
100%. And we can't wait to do it. We're ready. We're ready to go. The other thing you got to remember, too, is the enterprise is a total mess.
You said that on stage.
Let me explain what's happening.
That's your own industry you're talking about.
Exactly. But the industry is very good at what it does. So for 50 years, a half a century, everybody sold into an individual buying center or a silo. Finance, HR, sales, development. So now what you have is an unintegrated enterprise. So if you're a CEO right now, you're looking down to use AI, you're like, well, wait a minute, my people are swivel chairing between 17 applications a day, costing them almost 1/3 their productivity. Yeah. Why do you need to change? Because you can. And a lot of them don't know that.
But does one single device, I'm talking about a laptop or a desktop
No, but let me explain. Let me explain. It's not about a laptop or a desktop. It's about integration. 85% of the projects today in digital transformation fail to deliver an ROI for one single reason: integration. So we are that, as Ed Jensen would say, the AI operating system for the enterprise that integrates the past but invents the future. So NVIDIA, Dell Technologies, they're the future. We all have to still integrate the past. Jensen even said, on-premise is cool again. So what companies have to do is enable AI, but you have to do it by dealing with the past also. And I think simultaneously, if I was in a CEO situation and not working for ServiceNow, I'd have a co-pilot, I'd have Now Assist, I'd have the NVIDIA stack running everything, and I'd be using Dell Technologies across the enterprise. And you know what? I'm doing that.
You are doing it, but I grew up with Dell computers, right? And I'm talking about me playing Age of Empires, CD-ROM, that Dell computer.
Right.
Convince me and millions of people around the world that they have a place for the AI PC in their lives. You had 5 models, right? And that's quite a lot of choice for first gen of a nascent technology. You might disagree.
All our new PCs will be AI PCs, right? I mean, and the reason is that anything that you're doing that has an edit prompt is going to be sped up because every software developer in the world is figuring out how to use all this new power in the GPUs and the NPUs in these new AI PCs.
Neural processing units for the initiated.
So that experience will be better. So when your PC is now 4 years old, it's time for you to get a new one, right? You're going to want the one that speeds up those new capabilities. And inside your company, they're going to want to make sure you have that they don't want to buy a machine that's going to last for several years that doesn't have that capability.
Jensen, where is NVIDIA's place in the AI PC? I know you as gaming. That's, again, I grew up with the gaming side of NVIDIA. Yeah. Do you have a place in the AI PC market?
Come back next year. Exactly. There are a bunch of NVIDIA GPUs and Dell PCs, and Dell workstations. All of our GPUs have the same tensor cores that are running in H100s in the cloud. And so every one of our GPUs use AI to do its work. AI, of course, is going to transform gaming. All the NPCs, the non-player characters, they're going to be chatbots.
Think about development time, how it will be cut, for example.
Creating worlds is going to be easier. Instead of instruction-driven computing, it's now intention-driven computing. So it's easier to write programs. Python programs will be even easier to write. Video conferencing will be a lot better because of it. Yeah.
But what you did with Blackwell and other products is you innovated by saying, okay, let's combine GPU with CPU. Is that the next iteration for you in AI PC? You go, okay, here's the NVIDIA CPU that goes with it.
We want to support every CPU the world makes. And there are places that want x86. We support x86. Yes. There are places that prefer ARM. We support ARM. We just went to ISC, and the top most energy efficient supercomputers in the world are now powered by Grace hoppers. And so wherever it makes sense, we'll support the right CPUs, but we'll support every CPU.
Let's talk about the US leadership side of this. With 3 American CEOs. Is that news, frankly, in and of itself, that across all parts of the supply chain, they are American companies that are leading, Michael Dell?
I'm not not really sure that it's news because it's been, the U.S. has been leading in innovation for quite some time. But it's certainly a great thing for the United States and the U.S. economy to have, great companies like NVIDIA and ServiceNow and Microsoft, driving innovations, driving productivity and efficiency, and the world requires these new technologies to enable everything.
You talked on stage about your experience of the supply chain, your global experience of doing business, but do you see the same investment in Europe, Latin America, Southeast Asia?